Cruelty always sounds civilized in a ballroom. The winter assembly at Blackmere House glittered beneath 3 crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna 20 years earlier, their candlelight scattering across polished marble floors and the jewels of 200 carefully dressed guests who had gathered to celebrate the final social event before Christmas. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows. Violins drifted through the grand hall in slow, elegant movements. Servants moved like shadows between noble families who spoke in lowered voices polished smooth by generations of breeding and calculation. At the center of the ballroom, Lady Helena Vailcrest stood perfectly still beside her daughters. One beautiful, one forgotten. Aurelia Vailcrest had inherited her mother's golden hair and sharp smile. Men noticed her before she entered a room completely. Seraphina Vailcrest inherited nothing anyone considered useful. Her hair was dark brown instead of gold. Her eyes were gray instead of blue. She carried herself too quietly. She listened more than she spoke. In another family, those things might have passed unnoticed. In the Vailcrest household, they had become unforgivable. "Stand straighter," Helena murmured without looking at her younger daughter. Seraphina adjusted immediately. Her shoulders had already begun to ache beneath the pale silver gown borrowed from an older cousin 3 counties away. The sleeves sat slightly too narrow around her arms. The hem had been altered twice and still brushed unevenly across the floor. Helena noticed that too. Helena noticed everything when it came to Seraphina. "Honestly," her mother said softly, "you make elegance look like punishment." A few nearby women smiled into their champagne glasses. One of them pretended not to hear. Another failed entirely. Seraphina lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. She had learned years ago that silence shortened these moments faster than defense ever could. Across the ballroom, Duke Cassian Evermere stood near the western archway beside 2 members of parliament and a military attaché recently returned from France. He was 34 years old and carried authority the way other men carried expensive coats. Without effort. Without display. Tall. Dark-haired. Severe in profile. His black evening jacket fit with military precision against broad shoulders that had never softened into comfort. Society called him cold because society preferred men who smiled while lying. Cassian Evermere did neither. "You have not spoken 10 words all evening," Lord Whitmore observed with a laugh that attempted familiarity and failed. Cassian lifted a crystal glass slightly but did not drink from it. His attention rested somewhere beyond the conversation. "Perhaps His Grace regrets attending at all," another man suggested. "I regret most social obligations," Cassian replied evenly. The men laughed because powerful men did not require charm to be amusing. Near the center staircase, Helena Vailcrest accepted compliments about Aurelia's recent engagement prospects, while carefully excluding her younger daughter from every exchange. It happened with astonishing skill. She shifted her body half an inch, turned one shoulder, interrupted at precise moments. By the end of every conversation, Aurelia remained illuminated while Seraphina disappeared beside her like furniture placed too close to a wall. "Your eldest daughter will marry brilliantly," Lady Norwood declared. "Without question." Helena smiled with controlled satisfaction. "Aurelia understands her responsibilities." The silence afterward was deliberate. Lady Norwood glanced briefly toward Seraphina and then away again. "And the younger one?" someone asked lightly. Helena took a sip of champagne before answering. "Seraphina has always lacked practical value in society. She is far too emotional for strategy and far too quiet for charm." A few guests shifted awkwardly, not because the statement was cruel, because Helena had spoken it aloud. Seraphina kept her expression still. That was the part she had mastered best. Stillness. Her fingers tightened once around the stem of her untouched glass, then relaxed. Duke Cassian Evermere looked directly at her for the first time that evening. Not at her face. At her hand. The smallest tremor passed through her fingers before disappearing completely. Interesting, he thought distantly. Most people broke louder than that. The orchestra shifted into another waltz. Couples moved toward the center floor in waves of silk and polished shoes. Aurelia accepted a dance immediately. Helena watched proudly as her eldest daughter disappeared into the movement of nobility and candlelight. Seraphina remained beside her mother untouched and unnecessary. "Do not stand there looking miserable," Helena said under her breath. People will assume I raised you poorly. Yes, mother. And stop holding your shoulders that way. Yes, mother. You exhaust me. The final sentence landed softly, almost casually. Somehow that always hurt more. A servant carrying a tray of champagne approached too quickly while avoiding another couple crossing the ballroom. His sleeve brushed the edge of Serafina's borrowed gown. One glass tilted sideways. Pale gold liquid spilled across the front of Helena Veilcrest's ivory silk bodice. Silence rippled outward instantly. The young servant froze in horror. Helena looked down slowly at the stain spreading across imported French silk. Then she turned toward Serafina. Not the servant. Serafina. Of course, Helena said quietly. Of course this happened near you. Mother, it was an accident. Helena's hand struck her daughter's cheek with a sharp sound that vanished into the sudden stillness of the ballroom. No one gasped. Aristocratic cruelty rarely shocked aristocrats. Serafina staggered one step sideways before catching herself. The crystal glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the marble floor beside her slippers. You embarrass this family every time you breathe, Helena said. Her voice remained perfectly controlled. That made the humiliation worse somehow. Look at this gown. Look at this disaster. Serafina tasted blood faintly against the inside of her lip where her teeth had caught skin. She lowered her eyes immediately. Around them, guests pretended not to stare while staring completely. No one moved. No one intervened. The servant who had actually caused the accident looked close to fainting. Helena turned toward him coldly. Clean this mess before someone competent slips on it. The boy bent instantly toward the broken glass with shaking hands. Serafina saw one sharp crystal edge near his bare fingers. Instinct moved before thought. She lowered herself carefully onto the marble beside him despite the expensive guests watching from every direction. Allow me, she whispered. You will cut yourself. Miss, I can manage. Please. Her voice remained soft. Calm. The boy's hands trembled badly enough to drop another piece. Serafina gathered the largest shards first before they could injure him. Thin red lines appeared across her fingertips almost immediately where the crystal edges pressed too sharply into skin. She did not react. Above her, Helena stared in disbelief. Get up this instant. Serafina rose slowly with blood gathering against her pale fingers and tiny fragments of crystal resting in her palm. Her mother looked less concerned by the cuts than by the humiliation of witnessing them publicly. You kneel on the floor beside servants now? Helena demanded. Have you completely abandoned dignity? Several guests lowered their eyes. Others watched with quiet fascination. The orchestra had stopped entirely. At the far end of the ballroom, Cassian Evermere finally set down his untouched glass of champagne. The sound was almost inaudible, crystal touching wood. Yet 3 men near him immediately fell silent, because something in the Duke's expression had changed. Not anger. Cassian rarely displayed anger publicly. Worse than anger. Attention. He watched Serafina Veilcrest standing beneath the chandeliers with blood against her fingers and humiliation carefully hidden behind composure so controlled it bordered on frightening. Most women would have cried already. Most would have fled. She simply stood there breathing quietly through the pain while protecting the servant who had ruined her evening. Cassian began walking across the ballroom. Conversations died ahead of him one by one. Guests moved aside instinctively before realizing they were doing it. Helena noticed the movement first. Her expression shifted instantly into polished aristocratic charm. Your Grace, she said smoothly as he approached. What an honor. Cassian did not look at her. His eyes rested briefly on the blood along Serafina's hand, then on the broken crystal still scattered across the marble floor, then finally on Serafina herself. She looked up at him for the first time. Gray eyes meeting gray eyes beneath candlelight in silence. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath around them. Cassian removed one black leather glove slowly from his right hand. Then he held it out toward Serafina. Enough, he said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed correctly after that word. Because every person in Blackmere House understood immediately that the evening had just become something else entirely. No one in Blackmere House had ever heard Duke Cassian Evermere raise his voice. That was precisely why silence spread through the ballroom like winter water the moment he spoke. Helena Veilcrest recovered first. Women like Helena always did. Social survival had sharpened her instincts into weapons long ago. She smiled carefully, though a faint tightness appeared near the corners of her mouth. "Your Grace," she said with measured warmth, "I fear you have stepped into a private family misunderstanding." Cashin remained motionless beside Serafina. His removed glove still rested in his outstretched hand between them. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. His voice carried no visible emotion. Somehow that made Helena answer more cautiously than anger would have. "My daughter has always been sensitive. She tends to dramatize correction." Serafina kept her eyes lowered toward the black glove in front of her. Fine Italian leather. Impossibly smooth. She did not understand why he was offering it to her, or why the entire ballroom suddenly felt unsteady around a single quiet gesture. "Take it," Cashin said. She hesitated only half a second before placing the broken crystal carefully onto a nearby silver tray, and accepting the glove with trembling fingers. Warmth lingered faintly inside the leather from his hand. That unsettled her more than anything else had tonight. Helena noticed it too. "Your Grace, I assure you, there is no need for concern. Serafina is simply clumsy at times." Cashin finally turned toward Helena. The temperature of the room seemed to shift with the movement. "Is she?" Helena's smile faltered slightly. "I beg your pardon? You struck her." No accusation colored the sentence. It was spoken with the same detached clarity another man might use to comment on weather. Helena gave a soft dismissive laugh meant for the surrounding guests. A mother occasionally corrects her child. Surely society has not become so delicate that discipline is now scandalous. Near the orchestra platform, one violinist adjusted his posture nervously without realizing he was doing it. Nobody resumed speaking. Nobody resumed dancing. Cashin's attention drifted briefly toward the thin lines of blood still visible along Serafina's fingertips. "And humiliation?" he asked quietly. Helena straightened almost imperceptibly. "I protect my family from embarrassment." Interesting. One word. Nothing more. Yet several nearby nobles exchanged uneasy glances because the Duke of Evermere had a dangerous reputation for sounding calm moments before destroying reputations permanently. Serafina sensed the shift before she fully understood it. She had spent years studying rooms carefully enough to survive them. The guests were no longer watching her with amusement. They were watching Helena with caution. Aurelia Veilcrest stepped forward at last, her expression polished with concern that arrived suspiciously late. "Mother did not intend harm," she said gently. "Everyone is simply overwhelmed this evening." Cashin looked at Aurelia briefly. "Are they?" Aurelia's confidence dimmed beneath his gaze. Most women attempted to attract Cashin Evermere's attention. Very few survived holding it comfortably. Helena moved quickly to regain control. "Your Grace, perhaps we should allow the evening to continue without unnecessary discomfort. My daughter will recover." "Recover from what?" Cashin asked. Helena opened her mouth and stopped, because there was no answer acceptable enough for a ballroom filled with witnesses. Serafina wished desperately for the marble floor to open beneath her slippers. Every eye in the room remained fixed upon them. Her cheeks still burned faintly where her mother had struck her. Worse than the sting was the visibility of it. People had seen. They would remember. Tomorrow every drawing room in London would discuss the scene in careful, elegant language designed to sound sympathetic while tasting cruel. "Your Grace," Serafina said softly at last, "please do not trouble yourself. I am quite all right." Cashin looked at her fully then. She almost regretted speaking. Most men saw her vaguely or not at all. Cashin Evermere saw too much. His gray eyes moved once across her face before resting there with unnerving steadiness. "No," he said quietly. "You are not." The simplicity of the statement nearly undid her composure more effectively than cruelty ever had. Helena sensed the danger immediately. Not physical danger. Social danger. Power shifting away from her in real time. "Serafina," she said sharply, "you are making a spectacle of yourself." Serafina instinctively lowered her head. "Yes, mother." Cashin noticed that too. The immediate obedience. The reflexive apology in her posture even when she had done nothing wrong. Something cold settled deeper behind his expression. Lord Pembroke, an elderly viscount standing nearby, attempted an awkward laugh to dissolve the tension. Surely we have all witnessed family disagreements before. Let us not lose an entire evening over spilled champagne. Cashin turned his head slightly toward him. A woman was humiliated publicly. The Viscount cleared his throat. Of course. Naturally. I merely meant. I know what you meant. Silence returned instantly. The older man looked away first. Helena's fingers tightened around her fan. You are placing extraordinary importance upon a minor incident, Your Grace. No, Cashin replied. I am placing importance upon a repeated one. Serafina's breath caught faintly. Helena's face lost color for the first time all evening. I do not understand your meaning. I think you do. Cashin stepped closer toward Serafina then. Not enough to touch her. Enough for protection to become unmistakable. The ballroom noticed immediately. Women exchanged glances behind jeweled fans. Men straightened with sudden interest. Because the Duke of Evermere did not involve himself in society scandals. He especially did not position himself beside vulnerable women in public. Helena heard the whispers beginning already around the room. Her humiliation was becoming visible now. That frightened her far more than anger. Your Grace, she said carefully, perhaps my daughter should retire for the evening. Perhaps, Cashin agreed. Relief flashed briefly across Helena's face until he continued. But she will not be retiring with you. The sentence landed like a crack through frozen glass. Serafina looked up immediately. Your Grace. Helena stared openly now. I beg your pardon? Cashin extended his arm toward Serafina with calm inevitability. Miss Veilcrest will accompany me. Shock moved visibly through the ballroom. Even the servants standing along the walls exchanged startled glances before lowering their eyes again. Helena recovered enough to force a strained smile. Surely that would be inappropriate. Would it? Cashin asked. You seemed unconcerned with propriety a moment ago. Helena's composure slipped another inch. Serafina is my daughter. Yes, Cashin said softly. That appears to be the problem. The words struck harder because they were spoken without cruelty. Pure observation. Pure judgment. Serafina could not breathe correctly for several seconds. No one had ever spoken to her mother that way. Not once in 23 years. Helena's entire identity rested upon controlling every room she entered. Now the most powerful man inside Blackmere House stood dismantling that control sentence by sentence while barely raising his voice above conversation level. You overstep, Helena whispered. Cashin's expression did not change. No. You forgot where cruelty ends and public consequence begins. The orchestra members sat frozen with instruments resting silently in their laps. Snow continued drifting softly beyond the tall windows. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Serafina became suddenly aware of how tightly she still held the Duke's glove in her injured hand. Cashin noticed that too. You are bleeding, he said. She looked down as though surprised by the fact herself. Thin red lines marked her pale skin where the crystal had cut through. Tiny drops stained the edge of the black leather. Embarrassment rose immediately. I am sorry. Helena closed her eyes briefly as if exhausted by her daughter's existence. For heaven's sake. Cashin's gaze shifted slowly toward Helena again. She apologizes for being injured. Nobody in the ballroom moved at all after that. Because everyone understood the same thing simultaneously. The Duke of Evermere was no longer observing the situation. He was judging it. And when Cashin Evermere judged something unacceptable, society usually followed. Helena finally realized she was losing. Not privately. Publicly. Permanently. She changed tactics instantly. Serafina, she said with strained gentleness. Come here, darling. You are overtired. Darling. The word sounded unnatural in her mouth. Serafina heard it too. So did everyone else. Cashin waited. He did not command her. He simply remained beside her with terrifying stillness while the entire ballroom watched for her decision. Serafina stared at her mother. Then at the Duke beside her. Fear tightened quietly beneath her ribs because she understood something instinctively in that moment. Nothing would return to normal after tonight. Absolutely nothing. Serafina realized with quiet horror that every important moment of her life had happened while someone else decided what she was allowed to feel. The realization arrived suddenly beneath candlelight and silence while the entire ballroom waited for her to move. Helena Veilcrest still held out one gloved hand toward her daughter with brittle patience. "Come here," she repeated softly. "Do not embarrass yourself further. Embarrass yourself. Not embarrass the family. Not embarrass me." The distinction mattered. Serafina had spent years learning the precise language of conditional affection. Across from her, Duke Cassian Evermere said nothing at all. That frightened her more than pressure would have. He did not insist. Did not rescue dramatically. Did not perform outrage for the ballroom. He simply stood beside her as though the space itself had already shifted around them. Serafina became aware of her own breathing. Slow. Careful. Measured enough to prevent trembling. Her fingertips still stung faintly where the crystal had cut through skin. One thin drop of blood rested against the black leather glove she held against her palm. Helena noticed her hesitation and smiled tightly for the watching guests. "Serafina," she said. "Everyone is staring." The word struck with practiced precision. They always had. Since childhood, attention itself had been treated as punishment inside the Veilcrest household. At 7 years old, Serafina had spilled tea across an embroidered tablecloth during a dinner with visiting relatives from Sussex. Helena had not raised her voice then either. She merely instructed Serafina to stand beside the wall for the remaining 3 hours of the evening without speaking. Every guest had pretended not to notice the silent child standing motionless beside the curtains while conversations continued around her as though she were furniture. At 11, Serafina had laughed too loudly during a garden party after one of the stable dogs chased Lord Hawthorne into the fountain. Helena removed her from the celebration immediately and informed her later that ladies with value understand restraint. At 14, Serafina had cried after receiving news that her closest childhood friend would be leaving England permanently for America. Helena watched her quietly before saying, "No intelligent woman displays emotion before witnesses." Over time, Serafina stopped displaying almost everything. It became easier that way. Easier to survive rooms where warmth arrived conditionally and approval vanished without warning. Easier to become small before someone else forced it upon her. "Serafina." Helena's voice sharpened faintly. "Come here now." Serafina looked toward her mother automatically. Then she looked at Cassian. The Duke remained perfectly still beneath the chandelier light. Black evening coat. Silver cufflinks. Calm gray eyes that observed too carefully. For one strange impossible moment, Serafina understood something instinctively. He was waiting for her choice. No one had ever done that before. Not truly. Her father certainly had not. Edmund Veilcrest stood near the rear of the ballroom now beside 2 business associates pretending intense interest in a conversation that had died several minutes ago. Thin. Nervous. Respectable in the way weak men often were. He had watched the entire humiliation unfold without intervening once. When Serafina was 9 years old and frightened by a thunderstorm that rattled the windows hard enough to shake the upstairs portraits, she had gone searching for comfort and found her parents arguing quietly inside the library instead. "You indulge her too much," Helena had whispered sharply. "She is timid because you allow weakness." Edmund had glanced toward the half-open doorway where Serafina stood unnoticed and lowered his voice further. "She is only a child. And she will become an unbearable woman unless corrected now." Edmund never answered arguments directly after that. He simply disappeared around them. Over the years, Serafina learned not to expect protection from silence, which made Cassian Evermere's silence feel entirely different. "Mother," Aurelia said carefully, stepping closer at last, "perhaps we should simply return home." Helena ignored her eldest daughter completely. Her focus remained fixed on Serafina because Helena understood the true danger now. Not scandal. Loss of control. If Serafina disobeyed publicly even once, years of authority might begin unraveling in front of witnesses. "You are tired," Helena said with deliberate softness. "You are emotional. Come with me." Emotional. Another familiar word. Serafina remembered being 16 and quietly declining a marriage proposal from a viscount nearly twice her age whose estate carried enormous debt and 3 children already old enough to resent a second wife. Helena had stared at her afterward in cold disbelief. "Do you imagine your feelings matter in arrangements like this?" she had asked. Emotional women become poor women very quickly. The proposal had collapsed anyway after the Viscount secured a wealthier bride. Helena blamed Serafina for that too. "I am not emotional," Serafina said softly now before she could stop herself. The sentence was small, barely louder than the crackling fire near the orchestra platform. Yet Helena's expression changed instantly because contradiction itself had become unacceptable years ago. "Excuse me." Serafina felt fear tighten beneath her ribs immediately. Reflex urged apology, retreat, submission. But another feeling moved beneath the fear now. Confusion perhaps. Or exhaustion. "I only meant," she said carefully, "that I am all right." Helena stared at her daughter as though seeing a stranger beneath familiar skin. Cashin watched the exchange without interruption. The ballroom remained silent enough for candle flames to sound audible. Finally Helena gave a short controlled laugh. "You see what difficulty I endure, Your Grace." She has always possessed a tendency toward dramatics. Cashin spoke without looking away from Serafina. "No." Helena's smile froze. "No. She possesses restraint." The sentence altered the room instantly. Serafina felt it happen physically. Conversations that would spread tomorrow through London drawing rooms suddenly shifted shape entirely. She was no longer the embarrassing daughter publicly corrected by her mother. She had become the woman personally defended by the Duke of Evermere. Socially, those were two completely different creatures. Helena understood that before anyone else did. Panic flickered behind her composure for half a second, then disappeared. "Your Grace flatters her unnecessarily." "I do not flatter anyone." Several nearby guests looked away quickly because the statement was undeniably true. Cashin Evermere's reputation rested partly upon brutal honesty, delivered without theatrical cruelty. He rarely complimented anyone, which made the effect stronger when he did. Serafina became painfully aware of every person watching her now. Women studying her face for hidden beauty they had previously overlooked. Men reevaluating her worth through the dangerous lens of ducal attention. Nothing about her had changed in the last 5 minutes except where power had decided to stand. The realization unsettled her deeply. Cashin extended his arm slightly toward her again. "Miss Veilcrest." She looked up. "You are injured. My carriage is waiting outside." Helena inhaled sharply. "Absolutely not." Cashin turned toward her slowly. "You misunderstand. I was not requesting permission." The sentence fell into the ballroom with terrifying calm. Edmund Veilcrest finally stepped forward at last, perhaps realizing too late that continued silence would now appear cowardly instead of convenient. "Your Grace," he began nervously, "surely this matter can be resolved privately." Cashin regarded him briefly. "You had opportunity to resolve it privately." Edmund lost color immediately. Serafina felt something painful twist quietly in her chest. Not because the words were cruel, because they were deserved. Her father lowered his gaze. Helena stepped closer before he could answer. "Serafina will remain with her family." "Will she?" Cashin asked. Helena lifted her chin. "Naturally." Cashin looked toward Serafina then. "Directly. Completely. Is that your wish?" The question struck harder than humiliation ever had. Because nobody had asked her what she wished in years. Perhaps ever. Serafina opened her mouth once and closed it again. The ballroom waited. Helena waited. Cashin waited without pressure or impatience. Outside the tall windows, snow continued drifting softly across the dark London street beyond Blackmere House. Inside, warmth pressed heavily beneath chandeliers and candlelight in expectation. Serafina realized suddenly that fear had governed nearly every decision of her life. Fear of displeasing her mother. Fear of becoming inconvenient. Fear of needing too much. Fear of being seen clearly and discarded afterward. Yet standing beside Cashin Evermere created an entirely different fear altogether. The fear that if she accepted his protection even once, she might finally understand how little she had ever truly possessed before tonight. Her injured fingers tightened unconsciously around his glove. Cashin noticed the movement immediately. So did Helena. "Serafina," her mother said quietly, and for the first time that evening genuine warning entered her voice. "Do not make a mistake you cannot undo." Serafina looked at her mother for several long seconds. Then very carefully, Almost as though she were uncertain how the words should sound aloud, she answered. I think, she whispered. I already have. The silence after Serafina's answer did not feel shocked. It felt irreversible. Helena Veilcrest stared at her younger daughter as though the ballroom floor itself had shifted beneath her feet. Around them, candlelight flickered softly across crystal glasses and polished marble, while 200 members of London society pretended not to witness the collapse of a family's private hierarchy in real time. Serafina could hear her own heartbeat now, slow at first, then unsteady. She had not planned rebellion. The realization unsettled her almost as much as everyone else. Nothing about tonight had been intentional. She had simply grown too tired to continue shrinking correctly. Helena recovered with visible effort. You are confused, she said quietly. You are overwhelmed and embarrassed, and His Grace has unfortunately involved himself in a situation he does not fully understand. Cassian Evermere's expression remained unreadable. Then explain it. Helena blinked once. I beg your pardon? Explain what I do not understand. The request sounded polite. That made it more dangerous. Helena opened her mouth carefully, closed it again, because cruelty relied heavily upon privacy. Once exposed publicly, it became surprisingly difficult to defend. Edmund Veilcrest stepped forward another inch as though duty had finally cornered him into movement. Perhaps, he said weakly, perhaps everyone would benefit from calmer discussion tomorrow morning. Cassian looked toward him briefly. Would she? Edmund fell silent immediately. Serafina lowered her eyes. The question lingered painfully because she already knew the answer. Tomorrow morning would bring apologies spoken through clenched teeth. Coldness stretched across breakfast. Weeks of punishment disguised as correction. Helena never forgot public humiliation. Especially not humiliation caused by Serafina. Your Grace, Helena said, gathering the final remains of her composure, whatever grievances exist within my family are not appropriate topics for public examination. You examine them publicly yourself. Another precise sentence. Another shift in the room. Helena's fan snapped shut sharply between her fingers. You speak as though I have committed some monstrous offense. Cassian's gaze rested on Serafina's injured hand. No, Helena waited. I speak as though she expects injury before kindness. Serafina felt the words physically. Not because they were loud, because they were accurate. Several women nearby lowered their eyes into their champagne glasses. One older countess quietly pressed her lips together as though remembering something unpleasant from long ago. Social cruelty only shocked people when they recognized parts of themselves inside it. Aurelia stepped closer toward her sister at last. Her beauty remained immaculate beneath the chandeliers. Golden curls perfectly arranged. Pearl earrings catching candlelight each time she moved. Serafina, she said softly, please come home. Mother does not mean half the things she says when she is upset. Helena turned sharply toward her eldest daughter. Aurelia. The warning inside one word was enough. Aurelia fell silent instantly. Serafina watched the exchange with strange distance. She had spent years believing Aurelia stronger because Helena treated her better. Tonight she realized something else instead. Aurelia was simply loved conditionally in different ways. Cassian noticed that too. His attention moved briefly across the family before returning to Serafina. You should not remain here. Serafina tightened her grip slightly around his glove. I do not know where else to go. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. Too honest. Too vulnerable. Helena inhaled sharply through her nose. Honestly. Cassian answered before Helena could continue. You will come with me. The ballroom shifted again beneath the sentence. Not because the implication sounded scandalous. Because Cassian Evermere never offered protection lightly. Society understood instinctively that once he claimed responsibility for something, he rarely released it afterward. Helena understood that better than anyone. Absolutely not, she said immediately. A young unmarried woman cannot simply leave with a man in the middle of the night. You intended to send her home publicly humiliated and bleeding. Helena's eyes flashed. Do not lecture me about my daughter. Cassian regarded her quietly. Then behave as though she is one. A visible tremor passed through Helena's posture before disappearing beneath aristocratic control. Serafina felt suddenly exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The ballroom had grown too warm. Candle smoke lingered faintly in the air. Music remained suspended in unfinished silence near the orchestra platform where musicians sat frozen with instruments resting across their laps. Everyone waited for the next movement in a drama. No one dared interrupt. Serafina looked down at her dress. Champagne stains darkened the silver fabric near the waist. Tiny specks of blood marked one sleeve. She thought suddenly of being 13 years old and accidentally tearing one of Helena's imported lace gloves while helping organize trunks before summer travel to Bath. Helena had not shouted then either. She simply refused to speak directly to Serafina for 12 days afterward. 12 days of invisible punishment. No acknowledgement at breakfast. No response to questions. No eye contact at all. Serafina remembered thinking silence felt colder than anger because at least anger confirmed existence. Miss Veilcrest. Cashin's voice interrupted the memory gently. She looked up immediately. You are shaking. She had not realized it until he said it. Very slightly. Her hands trembled against the black leather gloves still resting in her fingers. Helena noticed and stepped forward at once. There, you see? She is exhausted. She has always been fragile under pressure. Fragile. Another familiar word. Serafina remembered falling ill one winter at 15 with fever severe enough to keep her confined upstairs for nearly 2 weeks. Helena visited only once. She stood near the bedroom door without approaching the bed and said, "You must recover quickly. Weak women become burdens very easily." Serafina recovered 3 days later and never mentioned pain aloud again. She is not fragile, Cashin said quietly. Helena laughed once without humor. You have known her for all of 10 minutes. Long enough. The words landed heavily because Cashin spoke them with complete certainty. Serafina stared at him before looking away quickly. Nobody had ever defended her without eventually demanding something in return. Teachers expected gratitude. Relatives expected obedience. Suitors expected usefulness. Kindness always arrived carrying hidden conditions. She could not yet identify his. That uncertainty frightened her. Helena seemed to sense the same thing. Serafina, she said sharply, come here now. Reflex moved first. Serafina nearly stepped forward automatically before stopping herself halfway. The small hesitation changed everything. Helena saw it. So did everyone else. For the first time in years, Serafina Veilcrest had paused before obeying her mother. Cashin's expression remained unreadable. Yet something in the ballroom shifted decisively toward him in that instant. Power recognized hesitation quickly. Helena lowered her voice dangerously. Do not humiliate me further. Serafina looked at her mother carefully then. Really looked perhaps for the first time. Helena stood flawless beneath crystal chandeliers in ivory silk and diamonds and cultivated social perfection. Beautiful. Controlled. Feared. Yet beneath the composure lived panic now. Not maternal concern. Fear of losing authority publicly. The realization hurt more than cruelty ever had because it stripped away the last fragile illusion Serafina still carried about being loved badly instead of merely managed. Mother, she whispered softly, I think you stopped seeing me a very long time ago. Helena stared at her daughter as though she had spoken another language entirely. Cashin watched Serafina with unnerving stillness. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Recognition, perhaps. As though he had been waiting for her to understand something about herself long before tonight began. Snow tapped softly against the tall ballroom windows. Somewhere downstairs, another carriage arrived outside Blackmere House. The ordinary sounds of London continued untouched while inside the ballroom, a woman's entire life quietly divided into before and after. Helena straightened fully. Whatever softness society sometimes mistook for maternal elegance vanished completely from her expression. If you leave this ballroom with him, she said calmly, do not expect to return to my house afterward. The threat landed cleanly. Efficiently. A final test of obedience disguised as dignity. Serafina felt the old fear rise immediately inside her chest because Helena never made empty threats. Every gown she owned remained inside the Veilcrest estate. Every possession. Every familiar room. Every certainty. She had no independent fortune. No husband. No social protection of her own. Women disappeared socially for less. Cashin spoke before silence could crush her again. Then she will not require your house. Helena turned toward him slowly. You presume a great deal, Your Grace. No, his gaze returned to Serafina. I decide quickly. The sentence should not have sounded gentle. Somehow it did anyway. Serafina realized suddenly that she could no longer remember the last time someone looked at her, as though her suffering inconvenienced them instead of burdened them. The distinction felt dangerously intoxicating. Her injured fingers loosened slightly around the Duke's glove, then tightened again. Cashin extended his arm toward her one final time. Miss Veilcrest. No pressure. No dramatic declaration. Just quiet certainty waiting beneath candlelight and falling snow. Serafina looked once toward her mother. Helena's face remained composed marble now. Cold. Beautiful. Impenetrable. Then Serafina placed her trembling hand lightly against Cashin Evermere's arm. And all across the ballroom, society inhaled at once. For one suspended moment after Serafina touched Cashin Evermere's arm, nobody inside Blackmere House seemed capable of movement. The orchestra remained silent beneath the chandeliers. Champagne glasses hovered halfway toward mouths that no longer drank. Even the servants along the walls appeared frozen by the weight of what had just occurred. Serafina felt it immediately. Not triumph. Exposure. As though she had stepped unknowingly onto the edge of something enormous and irreversible. Cashin did not look at the ballroom. He looked at her hand resting lightly against his sleeve. Her fingers trembled once before becoming still again. Then he covered her injured hand carefully with his own gloved palm. Not intimate. Protective. The gesture somehow shocked society more than if he had kissed her publicly. Helena Veilcrest watched the movement with absolute stillness. Her expression no longer carried anger. Anger required emotional investment. What remained now looked colder. Calculation, perhaps. Very well, she said quietly. If this is the spectacle you choose, I will not lower myself by arguing further. Serafina knew that tone. It meant punishment postponed, not abandoned. Cashin seemed to know it too. You mistake dignity for silence, he replied evenly. Helena's jaw tightened. And you mistake interference for nobility. No, his voice remained calm. I recognize neglect when I see it. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. The sentence landed too close to truths many families preferred hidden beneath etiquette and expensive clothing. Helena shifted her attention toward Serafina instead. You will regret this by morning. Serafina's throat tightened faintly. Perhaps she would. Fear still lived inside her chest. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of scandal. Fear of stepping beyond the narrow boundaries she had spent years learning never to cross. Yet beneath the fear existed something unfamiliar now. Relief. Small and fragile and terrifying. Cashin moved first. Come. One word. Nothing dramatic. Still the ballroom parted before them instinctively as he guided Serafina toward the grand staircase descending into the lower entrance hall. Society watched every step. Serafina could feel it physically against her skin. Whispers had already begun behind jeweled fans and lowered voices. She would become conversation by sunrise. Poor overlooked Serafina Veilcrest escorted from Blackmere House by the Duke of Evermere himself after a public confrontation with her mother. London would devour the story completely. Halfway toward the staircase, Serafina heard quick footsteps behind them. Serafina. Aurelia's voice carried softly through the silence. Serafina turned. Her sister stood several feet away, clutching her ivory gloves too tightly between pale fingers. For the first time all evening, Aurelia looked uncertain instead of polished. Aurelia stopped briefly. I did not know things had become so bad. Serafina studied her sister quietly. Beautiful Aurelia, who had always occupied the warmest spaces in every room without noticing who remained cold beside her. Yes, Serafina answered softly. You did. The words were not cruel. Somehow that made Aurelia flinch harder. Cashin waited beside Serafina without interruption or impatience. Aurelia glanced toward the Duke briefly before lowering her eyes again. Mother is frightened, she whispered. No, Serafina said gently. Mother is embarrassed. Aurelia had no answer for that. Cashin inclined his head once toward her with distant politeness before continuing toward the staircase. Serafina followed beside him while candlelight flickered across the marble steps below. At the top landing, she glanced back one final time. Helena still stood beneath the chandeliers in her ivory gown, surrounded by silent nobility and broken control. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Helena did not wave goodbye. She simply looked at her younger daughter with the expression of a woman mentally closing a door forever. Serafina turned away first. The lower entrance hall felt cooler than the ballroom above. Footmen stood near the massive front doors, pretending remarkable blindness toward unfolding scandal. One servant hurried forward immediately with Cashin's dark wool overcoat, while another moved to open the doors against the falling snow outside. Cold winter air swept through the hall instantly. Serafina inhaled sharply as the chill touched her face. It smelled clean compared to the ballroom upstairs. Snow and stone and carriage smoke. Real things. Cashin accepted his coat without removing his gaze from her injured hand. "Bring the physician tomorrow morning," he instructed one servant quietly. "And send word to Mrs. Ashbourne that we will have a guest." "Yes, Your Grace." Serafina looked up quickly. Guest. Not burden. Not complication. The distinction unsettled her more than kindness might have. Outside, a black carriage bearing the Evermere crest waited at the bottom of the front steps, while snow gathered softly along the roof and wheels. 2 lanterns glowed against the darkness of the London street beyond. Cashin paused near the doorway. "Can you walk comfortably?" The question startled her because nobody asked questions like that unless the answer mattered. "Yes." He studied her face briefly as though deciding whether she was telling the truth. Then he removed his own heavy black scarf and wrapped it once carefully around her shoulders before she could protest. Warmth settled immediately against her chilled skin, carrying the faint scent of cedar and winter air. Serafina looked down instinctively. "Your Grace, I cannot." "You can." Again the calm certainty. No room for refusal. A footman hurried down the carriage steps with an umbrella held awkwardly against the falling snow. Cashin ignored it completely and guided Serafina toward the carriage through the storm himself. Snowflakes gathered immediately across the dark shoulders of his evening coat. Serafina lifted her skirts slightly above the wet stone steps while trying not to slip. Her shoes were delicate satin designed for ballrooms rather than icy pavement. Halfway down, her balance shifted unexpectedly against a patch of frozen slush. She barely stumbled before Cashin's hand closed firmly around her waist to steady her. Not possessive. Immediate. Efficient. Yet the contact sent a sharp wave of awareness through her entire body, because no one had touched her gently in a very long time. Cashin released her the second she regained balance. "Careful." The word emerged quietly near her ear beneath falling snow. Serafina nodded once because her throat had suddenly become too tight for speech. He opened the carriage door himself rather than allowing the footman to do it. Another detail that felt strangely disorienting. Powerful men rarely performed small acts personally. "After you." Serafina hesitated briefly before stepping inside the carriage. Warmth wrapped around her instantly from a small brass heating box secured beneath the opposite seat. Dark green velvet lined the interior walls. A reading lamp flickered softly near the corner window beside neatly folded blankets prepared against the cold. Nothing appeared accidental. Cashin entered moments later, closing the carriage door firmly behind them while snow and distant ballroom music vanished outside. Silence settled immediately within the enclosed space. Not awkward silence. Controlled silence. The carriage lurched gently forward across the snowy London street. Serafina sat carefully against the far corner seat with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Cashin occupied the opposite side, facing her beneath dim golden lamplight. The space between them felt enormous despite measuring barely 4 feet across. Serafina became acutely aware of every detail at once. The quiet strength in his posture. The faint silver beginning near his dark temples. The small scar resting near his left wrist, partly hidden beneath a black glove. He watched her with unsettling attentiveness yet without intrusion, as though waiting for panic rather than demanding conversation. Outside, carriage wheels rolled steadily across wet cobblestones, while snow blurred the city beyond the windows into streaks of silver and shadow. Finally Cashin spoke. "You are cold." It was not a question. Serafina realized then that her hand still trembled slightly beneath the borrowed glove she carried. "I am all right." Cashin looked at her for one long quiet moment. You apologize for pain and deny discomfort automatically. Serafina lowered her eyes immediately. I did not mean to offend you. You did not. Another pause. Softer this time. You do not need permission to feel unwell. The sentence landed somewhere deep inside her chest with painful unfamiliarity. She stared toward the carriage window instead because suddenly she could not trust her expression. London passed outside in blurred shadows and gaslight while snow continued falling silently over the sleeping city. After several minutes, Cashin reached beside him toward a polished wooden compartment built into the carriage wall. He removed a clean white linen handkerchief and a small silver flask. Give me your hand. Serafina looked up instantly. Fear flickered automatically through her body before logic caught up. Cashin noticed that too. Something unreadable moved briefly behind his gray eyes. I am not going to hurt you, he said quietly. Shame rose hot beneath Serafina's skin because he should never have needed to say it at all. Slowly she extended her injured hand across the space between them. Cashin removed her blood-stained glove carefully. His movements remained precise and controlled, yet unexpectedly gentle for a man whose reputation terrified Parliament itself. The thin cuts across her fingers looked shallow beneath the carriage light, though dried blood still marked her pale skin. Cashin uncapped the silver flask. This will sting. I understand. The alcohol burned sharply against the small cuts. Serafina inhaled softly through her nose but did not pull away. Cashin noticed that too. Most people flinch. Most people are allowed to. The answer escaped before she could stop it. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Worse. Thoughtful. Cashin wrapped the clean linen slowly around her injured palm, afterward securing the makeshift bandage with careful precision. His large hands contrasted starkly against her smaller trembling ones. Serafina watched the movement, unable to look away entirely. Why? She asked suddenly. Cashin finished tying the linen before answering. Why what? Why involve yourself at all? Snow drifted quietly beyond the carriage windows. Cashin leaned back slightly into shadow after releasing her hand. For several seconds he said nothing. Then very calmly he answered. Because no one else did. Serafina did not answer immediately after his words because something inside her had gone strangely still. The carriage continued through snowy London streets with quiet rhythmic movement beneath them while warm lamplight flickered softly against dark velvet walls. Outside, the city blurred into golden shadow beyond the frosted windows. Inside, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt observant. Cashin leaned back slightly against the opposite seat after finishing the bandage around her hand. He did not release her fingers immediately. Not tightly. Merely long enough for warmth to linger before he withdrew his hand completely. Serafina lowered her gaze toward the white linen now wrapped carefully around her palm. No one had ever treated an injury of hers as though it deserved attention instead of criticism. The realization unsettled her more than the pain itself. You should not have done that, she said softly after several moments. Cashin watched her quietly. Done what? Intervened. Her voice remained calm though her fingers tightened unconsciously against the bandage. My mother will not forgive public humiliation. Neither should you. The answer came without hesitation. Serafina looked toward the carriage window again. Snow gathered softly across the corners of the glass. London moved around them in distant muted sounds. Hooves striking whetstone. Wheels rolling through slush. A drunk man laughing somewhere beyond the darkness before fading away entirely. You do not understand, she whispered. Cashin's expression remained unreadable. Then explain it. The invitation sounded simple. She found herself unexpectedly unable to answer. Because where would she begin? With the endless corrections disguised as refinement. The silence at family dinners whenever she spoke too freely. The way Helena Vailcrest could reduce an entire room to tension simply by lowering her voice half an octave. Serafina remembered being 10 years old and returning home from a music lesson with fingers sore from practicing scales for nearly 3 hours. Her instructor had praised her progress warmly before Helena interrupted to say, "Talent without discipline is still mediocrity." Serafina had practiced until midnight afterward despite her hands aching badly enough to tremble. Helena never attended another lesson personally after that because she no longer needed to. Serafina had learned how to wound herself preemptively before disappointment could arrive from anyone else. Miss Veilcrest. Cashin's voice interrupted her thoughts carefully. You are somewhere unpleasant. She blinked once before realizing her breathing had changed. Too shallow. Too controlled. I am sorry. Stop apologizing for existing. The sentence landed harder than criticism ever had because it carried no cruelty whatsoever. Serafina stared at him fully for the first time since entering the carriage. Cashin Evermere held her gaze steadily beneath the soft lamplight. Most powerful men demanded attention loudly. Cashin never needed to. Authority settled around him naturally, quietly, like winter settling over a field. You speak as though it is simple, she said at last. It is not. No, he agreed calmly. It is learned. The carriage turned sharply onto a quieter street lined with dark townhouses and iron gates coated lightly in snow. Serafina recognized the district immediately even through the frosted windows. Belgrave Square. Wealth so old and established it no longer required display. Your mother trained you to anticipate punishment, Cashin continued evenly. Now you mistake survival instincts for personality. Serafina looked down quickly because something painful tightened beneath her ribs. You have known me less than an hour. And yet. He let the unfinished sentence rest between them. Somehow that was worse. The carriage slowed briefly while passing another noble carriage heading in the opposite direction. Through the window Serafina caught a glimpse of a familiar face from the ballroom staring openly toward the Evermere crest before whispering something sharp behind a gloved hand. Gossip was spreading already. By morning London would build entire fantasies around tonight. Some would call her manipulative. Others ambitious. A desperate girl trapping the attention of a powerful duke. Society preferred stories where women caused their own suffering because it made everyone else feel safer. You are worried about tomorrow, Cashin observed. Serafina managed a faint humorless smile. Tomorrow appears to be worried about me as well. Something almost imperceptible shifted near the corner of his mouth then. Not quite amusement. Close enough to unsettle her further. London survives scandal remarkably well, he said. Women do not always. Silence followed again. Serafina folded her uninjured hand carefully against the bandaged one resting in her lap. I have no fortune, she admitted quietly. No position independent from my family. If my mother truly refuses to let me return. She stopped. The rest remained too humiliating to say aloud. Cashin answered anyway. You will not be abandoned. The certainty in his voice frightened her because she realized instantly he meant it completely. Why? She asked again. People do not simply rescue inconvenient women from ballrooms without reason. Cashin's gaze drifted briefly toward the snowy window before returning to her. No, he said softly. Most people do not. The carriage rolled through massive black iron gates moments later. Serafina straightened slightly in surprise as the Evermere estate emerged beyond the darkness. She had heard descriptions before, of course. Everyone in London had. Yet the reality still felt startling beneath falling snow and lantern light. Evermere House rose from the winter landscape like something carved from silence itself. Gray stone. Tall windows glowing warm gold against the night. Wide front steps lined with iron lanterns flickering through drifting snowflakes. Elegant without ornament. Powerful without effort. The carriage slowed along a circular drive where servants already waited beneath the covered entrance despite the late hour. They moved immediately the moment the carriage stopped. No confusion. No visible surprise. As though the household had been expecting unusual instructions all evening. That realization unsettled Serafina deeply. Cashin stepped out first before turning back toward her. Snow gathered instantly across the dark shoulders of his coat again. He offered his hand without ceremony. Serafina hesitated only briefly before accepting it. His grip remained steady and warm against the winter cold. The front doors opened before they even reached the steps. Light spilled outward across polished stone and drifting snow. A tall silver-haired woman stood waiting inside the entrance hall wearing dark navy silk, and an expression of composed intelligence sharpened by age rather than softened by it. She was perhaps 60 years old though carried herself with enough precision to make guessing difficult. Your Grace, she said calmly as they entered. Her gaze moved once toward Seraphina's stained gown and bandaged hand. Nothing in her expression suggested surprise. "Mrs. Ashbourne," Cashin replied. "Miss Veilcrest will be staying with us temporarily." Temporarily. The word should have reassured Seraphina. Instead, disappointment flickered somewhere quietly beneath her ribs before she could stop it. Mrs. Ashbourne stepped closer immediately. Of course. Her attention settled gently on Seraphina. Not invasive. Professional. Kind in a restrained, unfamiliar way. "You must be freezing, Miss Veilcrest." Seraphina realized suddenly that she was. Now that someone acknowledged the cold, her entire body seemed to notice it at once. Snow melted slowly along the hem of her ruined silver gown. Her slippers were damp from the icy pavement outside. She still wore Cashin's scarf around her shoulders, carrying faint warmth and cedar scent. "I am sorry for arriving so late," she said automatically. Mrs. Ashbourne's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not pity. Recognition, perhaps. "You are a guest here," she replied softly. "Guests do not apologize for needing shelter." The sentence struck Seraphina hard enough that she nearly looked away. Cashin removed his gloves slowly beside her. "Prepare the East guest suite." Mrs. Ashbourne paused briefly. The smallest hesitation. Then she inclined her head. "Immediately, Your Grace." Seraphina noticed the hesitation because years of surviving Helena Veilcrest had trained her to observe every shift in tone and posture around her. Something about the East guest suite mattered. Before she could wonder further, another servant approached carrying a folded cream-colored blanket warmed near the fire. Cashin accepted it and placed it carefully around Seraphina's shoulders himself. "You are pale." "I am all right." His gray eyes rested on her face steadily. "No," he said quietly once more. "You are simply accustomed to pretending." The grand entrance hall fell silent after that. Firelight flickered softly against marble floors and tall portraits lining the staircase walls above them. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a grandfather clock chimed midnight. Seraphina stood there wrapped in warmth she had not requested inside a home. She did not understand beside a man whose attention felt more dangerous than cruelty, because she could not yet find the condition hidden beneath it. And for the first time in her life, no one around her seemed willing to let her disappear quietly into the background again. Mrs. Ashbourne escorted Seraphina upstairs herself rather than assigning a servant to the task, and somehow that small decision unsettled Seraphina more than the grandeur of Evermere House itself. The staircase curved upward beneath soft golden light cast by wall sconces shaped like iron lilies. Thick burgundy runners muted every footstep against polished dark wood. Portraits lined the walls ascending toward the second floor. Men with stern silver eyes. Women draped in velvet and diamonds whose expressions suggested they had spent lifetimes enduring things quietly. Seraphina noticed one portrait in particular halfway up the staircase. A dark-haired woman standing beside a snow-covered lake wearing deep green silk, and an expression of restrained sadness that felt strangely familiar. Mrs. Ashbourne followed her gaze briefly. "The Dowager Duchess Evelyn Evermere," she explained softly. "His Grace's mother." Seraphina looked away quickly. "She was beautiful." "Yes," Mrs. Ashbourne said after a pause. "And very lonely." Something in the older woman's tone suggested history best left untouched. They continued upward through the quiet house. Evermere House did not resemble the Veilcrest estate despite being nearly twice its size. The Veilcrest home had always felt arranged for observation. Every room positioned carefully to impress guests and display status. Evermere House felt lived in. Not warm exactly, but inhabited. Books rested on side tables beside half-burned candles. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases despite the winter season. A chessboard remained unfinished near one sitting room doorway as though someone intended to return later and continue thinking. Seraphina found herself staring at these small details because they felt oddly intimate. "You are wondering why the East Suite surprised me," Mrs. Ashbourne said quietly without looking at her. Seraphina blinked once. "I apologize. I did not mean to stare. You observe constantly. That is not the same thing." They reached the second-floor landing where tall windows overlooked the snow-covered grounds beyond the estate. Moonlight reflected softly across untouched white gardens and black iron fencing disappearing into the distance. "His Grace rarely allows guests into the East Wing," Mrs. Ashbourne continued carefully. The rooms remain prepared regardless. Serafina felt unease stir quietly beneath her ribs. Prepared for whom? Mrs. Ashbourne opened a pair of tall double doors at the end of the corridor before answering. That, she said gently, is a question I suspect His Grace will answer himself if he wishes to. The East Suite did not resemble any guest room Serafina had ever imagined. She stopped just inside the doorway instinctively. Warmth drifted softly from a marble fireplace where fresh logs already burned with steady golden light. Cream-colored curtains framed massive windows overlooking the snowy eastern gardens. Shelves lined one wall filled with books bound in soft leather. A writing desk stood near the fire beside fresh paper, and ink prepared carefully beneath a reading lamp. Nothing appeared untouched or decorative for appearance alone. The room felt ready. Used perhaps. Waiting. Your belongings may arrive tomorrow if you wish them sent for, Mrs. Ashbourne said. Serafina stared silently toward the wardrobe standing partially open near the dressing room entrance. Several gowns already hung inside. Not many. 5 perhaps. Yet every color resembled shades Serafina herself would have chosen. Deep blue. Silver gray. Forest green. Nothing bright or overly adorned. Her pulse slowed strangely. I do not understand. Mrs. Ashbourne followed her gaze. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the older woman's face before disappearing completely. Neither do I entirely, she admitted softly. But I stopped questioning His Grace's decisions many years ago. Serafina moved slowly farther into the room. One of the books resting near the fireplace caught her attention immediately. A worn copy of Jane Eyre with pressed lavender tucked carefully between the pages near the middle chapters. Serafina froze faintly because she owned the exact same edition herself back at the Valecrest estate. Or had owned perhaps. Helena would likely burn anything left behind simply to prove ownership. Miss Valecrest. Mrs. Ashbourne's voice softened further. Are you unwell? Serafina looked toward the book again before answering. No. Only tired. That at least was true. Exhaustion settled into her bones now that adrenaline had begun fading from the evening. Her cheek still ached faintly where Helena had struck her. Her feet hurt from hours inside damp satin slippers. Emotionally she felt hollowed out. As though someone had removed the structure of her old life without replacing it yet with anything understandable. Mrs. Ashbourne approached the fireplace and adjusted one burning log carefully with a brass poker. A bath is being prepared in the adjoining room, she said. And a tray will arrive shortly. Tea, soup, bread. Serafina instinctively shook her head. Please do not trouble the kitchen at this hour. Mrs. Ashbourne looked at her directly then. Miss Valecrest. Serafina fell silent. No one here considers feeding you an inconvenience. The sentence landed painfully because it should not have sounded remarkable. Yet it did. Deeply. Mrs. Ashbourne seemed to notice that too. You may ring for anything you require tonight, she continued. Additional blankets. Candles. Another fire. Whatever makes you comfortable. Comfortable. Another strange unfamiliar word. Serafina remembered once waking from a nightmare at 12 years old after dreaming Helena had locked her outside during a snowstorm. She had gone downstairs unable to sleep and wrapped herself in blankets near the library fireplace where she accidentally fell asleep against the sofa. Helena found her there at dawn and said coldly, "Drawing attention to discomfort is not dignity." After that, Serafina learned to suffer quietly enough that no one needed to respond. "Thank you," she whispered now. Mrs. Ashbourne inclined her head once before moving toward the door. Then she paused. "One more thing." Serafina looked up. His Grace instructed the staff personally that no one is to disturb you tonight unless you request it. The statement carried weight beyond courtesy. Protection. Privacy. Control. Serafina felt unease mixed quietly with something more dangerous. Safety. Mrs. Ashbourne left moments later, leaving the suite wrapped in soft firelight and silence. Serafina remained motionless near the center of the room for several seconds after the doors closed behind her. The quiet felt different here. Not tense like the silence inside the Valecrest household where every pause carried risk. This silence rested gently around her instead. She removed Cashin's scarf slowly from her shoulders. The dark wool still held faint warmth from his body, and the subtle scent of cedar and winter air. Her fingers tightened briefly against the fabric before she folded it carefully over the back of a nearby chair. Then she noticed something else. A small porcelain dish resting atop the writing desk beside the lamp. White winter roses floated in shallow water inside it. Serafina crossed the room slowly and touched one pale petal with cautious fingertips. White roses had always been her favorite flowers. No one knew that. At least no one should have. Helena preferred orchids because they appeared expensive. Aurelia adored peonies. Serafina had once planted white roses secretly behind the old greenhouse near the northern garden wall because she liked how quiet they looked in moonlight. Helena ordered them removed the following spring during landscaping renovations without ever realizing who planted them. Serafina stared at the flowers now with unease spreading slowly beneath her skin. The gowns. The book. The roses. None of it felt accidental anymore. A knock sounded softly at the door before she could think further. A maid entered carrying a silver tray with soup, fresh bread, tea, and a folded cream nightgown resting neatly beside several small toiletry bottles. The young woman curtsied politely. "If you need assistance with your hair or gown, miss, I can return." Serafina instinctively stepped backward. "No, thank you. I can manage." The maid smiled gently without offense. "Very good, miss." Mississippi. Not Miss Veilcrest, spoken sharply across drawing rooms. Not girl. Not inconvenience. Just miss. The maid disappeared quietly afterward, leaving Serafina alone once more. She stared at the tray for several long seconds before realizing something else strange. The soup smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic. Her favorite. Again impossible. Serafina sat slowly beside the fireplace. The room warmed her chilled skin gradually while snow drifted beyond the windows in soft silver patterns. She picked up the teacup carefully with both hands and realized suddenly she had not once flinched during the last 15 minutes waiting for criticism to arrive. The absence of fear felt almost frightening by itself. Across the room the bathwater steamed faintly beyond the open dressing room door. Firelight flickered against marble. Somewhere deep below the second floor a grandfather clock chimed once. Then silence settled again. Serafina lowered her gaze toward the white bandage wrapped around her palm by Cashin's steady hands only an hour earlier. Because no one else did. His words returned quietly through her thoughts. She should have felt grateful, perhaps. Relieved. Instead she felt watched. Not in a cruel way. Worse. Carefully. Intentionally. As though tonight had not begun with impulse at all. Her attention drifted slowly back toward the white roses floating beside the lamp, then toward the bookshelf, then toward the wardrobe containing dresses in colors she would have chosen herself. Cold unease moved softly through her chest because one impossible thought kept returning no matter how hard she tried dismissing it. This room did not feel prepared for a guest. It felt prepared for her. Serafina slept badly despite the warmth of the room. Dreams came in fragments throughout the night. Candlelight reflected across ballroom marble. Helena's voice sharp and controlled. Cash and Evermere standing motionless beneath crystal chandeliers, while the entire world seemed to rearrange itself around his silence. Several times she woke disoriented by unfamiliar softness beneath her hands because the bed at Evermere House did not feel like the narrow rigid mattress inside her room at the Veilcrest estate. Thick blankets surrounded her with impossible warmth. The fire remained burning low in the marble hearth across the room. No one had extinguished it to save expense overnight. No one had entered to criticize the disorder of her discarded gown draped carefully across a chair near the dressing room. By dawn she abandoned any attempt to sleep further. Pale winter light filtered softly through cream curtains, while snow continued falling beyond the windows in slow drifting silence. Serafina sat upright against the pillows for several minutes, simply listening to the unfamiliar quiet around her. No footsteps approaching her door sharply. No servants hurrying anxiously through hallways anticipating Helena's morning moods. No tension pressing beneath the walls themselves. The absence felt unnatural. Dangerous almost. She slipped carefully from bed wearing the cream nightgown left for her beside the bath hours earlier. The fabric startled her when she first touched it the night before. Soft cotton lined with silk at the sleeves. Comfortable rather than decorative. Helena always preferred garments that looked expensive regardless of whether breathing inside them felt possible. Serafina crossed toward the windows slowly and parted the curtains slightly. Morning covered Evermere House in silver light and untouched snow. The eastern garden stretched below in quiet, elegant lines disappearing toward dark iron gates at the far edge of the property. A frozen fountain stood near the center courtyard where two stone swans wore delicate crowns of snow across their carved heads. Beautiful. Still. Controlled. Yet alive somehow in ways the Veilcrest estate had never managed despite all Helena's perfection. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Serafina stiffened instinctively before realizing no fear followed the sound. "Miss Veilcrest," a gentle female voice called through the door. "May I enter?" The question startled her more than the interruption itself. Servants at the Veilcrest estate rarely requested permission from her because Helena considered it unnecessary. "Yes," Serafina answered quickly. A young maid entered carrying a breakfast tray balanced carefully in both hands. She looked perhaps 19 years old with chestnut hair tucked neatly beneath a white cap and intelligent hazel eyes that missed very little. "Good morning, miss," she said warmly. "Mrs. Ashbourne asked me to bring breakfast before the physician arrives." "Physician?" Serafina looked automatically toward her bandaged hand resting against the curtain. "There is no need for a physician." The maid smiled faintly while arranging tea and breakfast beside the fireplace. "His Grace disagrees." Of course he did. The realization brought another strange flicker of warmth and unease together beneath Serafina's ribs. The tray itself appeared impossibly thoughtful. Fresh tea, toast with blackberry preserves, soft-boiled eggs, sliced pears arranged carefully beside warm oatmeal topped with cinnamon. Helena always insisted breakfast remain minimal for unmarried daughters because appetite without restraint reflects poorly on discipline. Serafina had grown accustomed to coffee and dry toast alone most mornings. "Thank you," she said quietly. The maid curtsied lightly. "My name is Clara, miss. If you need anything while staying here, you may ask me directly." Staying here. Not visiting. Not hiding. The distinction lingered. "Clara," Serafina repeated softly. "Thank you." Clara hesitated briefly before glancing toward the wardrobe. "Mrs. Ashbourne also sent several dresses this morning. She worried your own gowns might be uncomfortable after last night." Serafina followed her gaze automatically. More dresses now rested beside the originals inside the wardrobe. Dark blue wool. Gray silk trimmed simply at the collar. Cream cashmere suitable for daytime. Every piece elegant without excess. Every piece somehow precisely her taste again. Serafina felt cold unease move quietly beneath her skin. "Did His Grace choose these?" Clara looked surprised by the question. "I believe so, miss. Personally." "Yes." Clara paused. The modiste arrived before dawn. Before dawn. Serafina stared toward the wardrobe silently. Cash and Evermere had ordered gowns selected for her before sunrise. Not generic guest clothing. Specific colors. Specific fabrics. Things she herself would have chosen. Clara seemed to sense the shift in her expression. "Miss." Serafina forced herself back into the room. "Nothing. I am simply unaccustomed to such generosity." Clara's face softened unexpectedly. "That will change here." The statement landed with quiet confidence rather than flattery. As though Evermere House itself operated under entirely different laws than the world Serafina knew. A second knock interrupted before she could answer. Mrs. Ashbourne entered moments later dressed impeccably in charcoal silk despite the early hour. "Good morning, Miss Veilcrest." Serafina instinctively moved to stand straighter beside the window. "Good morning." Mrs. Ashbourne studied her carefully. "Did you sleep at all?" "Somewhat." "That means no." The older woman's tone carried dry understanding rather than criticism. She stepped farther inside while Clara quietly finished arranging breakfast before slipping from the room. "Dr. Whitmore has arrived," Mrs. Ashbourne continued. "Only to examine your hand and cheek briefly." His Grace insisted. Serafina lowered her gaze. "I do not wish to cause inconvenience." Mrs. Ashbourne sighed almost imperceptibly. "You truly believe care must be earned first, do you not?" Serafina had no answer for that. Mrs. Ashbourne crossed toward the fireplace instead. "There is another matter you should know before breakfast." Unease stirred immediately inside Serafina's chest. "What matter?" Mrs. Ashbourne folded her hands calmly before her. "Your mother sent 3 letters before 7 this morning." Serafina's stomach tightened. Of course Helena had acted immediately. What did they say? The first demanded your immediate return home. Mrs. Ashbourne's expression remained perfectly neutral. The second threatened legal and social consequences if His Grace continued harboring an unmarried daughter of another noble household. Serafina closed her eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Helena. And the third? Mrs. Ashbourne paused. The third requested a private audience with His Grace this afternoon. Serafina looked toward the window again while snow drifted silently beyond the glass. Helena would not beg. Not openly. Which meant she intended negotiation instead. Control restored through strategy rather than affection. Will he meet with her? Mrs. Ashbourne regarded Serafina quietly for several seconds before answering. His Grace has not decided. Another detail unsettled her then. Not because Helena requested audience with Cassian Evermere. Because Helena had addressed him directly rather than demanding Serafina's obedience through her. For the first time in years, Helena no longer seemed entirely certain she still owned the situation. Miss Veilcrest. Mrs. Ashbourne's voice softened slightly. You should understand something clearly. Serafina looked up. His Grace does not act impulsively. The sentence settled heavily into the room. I do not understand. No, Mrs. Ashbourne agreed calmly. But you will. Before Serafina could ask further, another sound interrupted from the open doorway leading toward the adjoining sitting room. A man's voice. Low. Familiar. Mrs. Ashbourne. Serafina turned immediately. Cassian stood just beyond the threshold wearing a dark charcoal coat over a crisp white shirt opened slightly at the collar rather than fully formal morning attire. Snow no longer touched him. Yet winter seemed to follow him indoors somehow regardless. He looked toward Serafina first before acknowledging anyone else. Gray eyes steady. Observant. You are awake. The simple statement sent awareness moving sharply through her chest again. Yes, Your Grace. His gaze moved briefly across her face as though checking for signs of distress before turning toward Mrs. Ashbourne. Dr. Whitmore may come up in 10 minutes. Of course. Mrs. Ashbourne inclined her head slightly before leaving the room with deliberate smoothness that felt suspiciously intentional. Suddenly Serafina found herself alone with Cassian Evermere in the morning quiet of the East Suite while snow drifted silently beyond the windows and untouched breakfast cooled beside the fire. Cassian remained near the doorway for several moments without speaking. His attention rested briefly on the untouched tray. You have not eaten. I was not hungry. That is unlikely. Again the calm certainty. Serafina folded her hands carefully before her. Mrs. Ashbourne informed me my mother sent letters. Cassian's expression did not change. She did. Will you answer them? Eventually. The answer revealed absolutely nothing. Serafina studied him cautiously. You do not appear concerned. About Helena Veilcrest? His tone remained even. No, the confidence inside those 2 letters should have reassured her. Instead it deepened the strange feeling growing slowly beneath her unease since arriving here. Cassian did not behave like a man reacting spontaneously to a ballroom scandal. He behaved like someone moving pieces across a board already studied thoroughly beforehand. Your Grace, she said carefully, may I ask you something honestly? You may. Serafina hesitated only briefly. Were you truly surprised to see me last night? Silence followed. Not long. Just long enough for her pulse to quicken beneath the weight of it. Cassian looked toward the snow beyond the windows once before returning his gaze to her face. No, he said quietly. The room seemed to still around the answer. Serafina felt cold move slowly beneath her skin despite the warmth of the fire. Then you knew I would be there. Yes. How? Cassian stepped farther into the room at last. Controlled. Precise. Dangerous in his calmness. Because, he said softly, I arranged for the invitation myself. The room remained completely silent after his confession. Firelight flickered softly across the marble hearth while snow drifted beyond the tall windows in slow silver patterns. Serafina stared at Cassian Evermere without moving because suddenly every strange detail from the previous 12 hours rearranged itself into something far more unsettling. The invitation. The prepared suite. The gowns. The roses. None of it had been coincidence. You arranged it, she repeated quietly. Cashin held her gaze steadily. Yes. Serafina felt her pulse quicken beneath her skin. Why? He did not answer immediately. Instead he crossed toward the fireplace with measured calm, and adjusted one burning log slightly using the brass poker resting nearby. The ordinary movement contrasted sharply against the tension gathering inside the room. Blackmere House hosts 3 winter assemblies every season, he said at last. Your family has not attended one in nearly 4 years. Serafina frowned faintly. Mother dislikes Lord Blackmere. Your mother dislikes rooms she cannot control. The observation arrived without emotion. Accurate. Serafina folded her hands tightly together. Then why invite us now? Cashin set the poker aside carefully before turning back toward her. Because Helena Valecrest's debts became impossible to ignore. The sentence struck unexpectedly. Debts. Your father invested heavily in rail expansion 2 years ago. Cashin's tone remained calm. The investments failed. Quietly at first. Then catastrophically. Serafina stared at him. No one told me that. No, his gray eyes rested steadily on her face. They would not. Her thoughts moved quickly backward through the last year, searching suddenly for details she had ignored. Helena selling several paintings supposedly for redecorating. Dinner parties becoming smaller. Her father's increasing silence at breakfast. Aurelia's engagement discussions growing strangely urgent despite Helena's earlier selectiveness. Serafina felt cold realization settle slowly beneath her ribs. The Viscount Harrow proposal. Cashin inclined his head once. Yes. Shame burned faintly across her skin, remembering the aging Viscount with stained teeth and restless hands who had studied her during dinner like livestock under consideration. Mother said the match was respectable. It was profitable. The bluntness of the answer made her flinch slightly. Cashin noticed. You were not intended to remain unmarried this season, he continued evenly. Your mother could no longer afford sentiment. Serafina almost laughed at the absurdity of the word. Helena had never possessed sentiment regarding her younger daughter. Only strategy. How do you know all this? She asked quietly. Cashin moved no closer, yet somehow the room still felt smaller beneath his attention. Because financial collapse among noble families becomes Parliament's concern eventually. And my family interested Parliament? No, another pause. You interested me. The words settled heavily between them. Serafina looked away, first toward the breakfast tray cooling untouched beside the fire. Her appetite had vanished completely now. That does not explain the invitation. Cashin studied her for several long seconds before answering. 3 months ago Lord Blackmere mentioned your mother intended presenting Aurelia publicly again before finalizing negotiations with Lord Whitmore's son. Serafina remembered the conversation now. Helena discussing invitations sharply with servants while dismissing Serafina from the room halfway through. I asked whether you would attend as well. Unease tightened quietly through her chest. Why? Cashin's expression revealed nothing easily. Because I wanted to see if the rumors were true. Rumors. That Helena Valecrest treated one daughter as an heir and the other as collateral. Serafina inhaled softly. No one had ever spoken the truth aloud so directly before. Not even herself. Cashin continued before she could answer. Most rumors are exaggerated. His gaze lowered briefly toward the bandaged hand resting against her lap. These were not. Silence followed again. Serafina felt strangely unsteady, as though the floor beneath her understanding had shifted overnight. So you watched? Yes. And when my mother humiliated me publicly? I intervened. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than explanations might have. Why? She asked again. People witness cruelty every day in that ballroom. No one else cared. I cared. The words arrived immediately. Quiet. Certain. Serafina looked up sharply. Cashin remained standing near the fire with one hand resting lightly against the marble mantel. Nothing dramatic existed in his posture. Yet the entire room seemed shaped around his calmness somehow. You do not even know me, she whispered. Something unreadable moved briefly through his expression, then vanished. That, he said softly, depends how one defines knowing. Before Serafina could respond, another knock sounded lightly against the suite doors. Dr. Whitmore entered moments later carrying a black leather medical bag beneath one arm. He was perhaps 50 years old with silver hair and kind observant eyes sharpened by decades treating aristocrats who preferred pretending injury did not exist. "Miss Vailcrest," he greeted warmly. "I promise His Grace exaggerates catastrophically when concerned." Serafina glanced instinctively toward Cashin, who showed no reaction whatsoever to the accusation. "I am quite well," she assured the physician. "Naturally," Dr. Whitmore replied dryly. "That is what wounded people always say directly before fainting into expensive carpets." To Serafina's surprise, the faintest trace of amusement crossed Cashin's expression again before disappearing. The physician examined her hand first with gentle efficiency. "Shallow cuts," he murmured. "Cleanly treated already." He looked toward Cashin briefly. "Better work than most army medics. I dislike incompetence." Clearly. Dr. Whitmore rewrapped the bandage carefully before examining the fading redness along Serafina's cheek. His expression remained professionally neutral, though his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "No lasting damage," he said softly. "Though I recommend ice later if tenderness worsens." Tenderness. Such a gentle word for humiliation. Serafina nodded quietly. "Thank you." The physician packed away his instruments moments later before pausing near the doorway. "One more thing," he said lightly while addressing Cashin. "Lord Whitmore requested an urgent audience downstairs." Serafina stiffened instantly. Lord Whitmore, father of the man negotiating Aurelia's engagement. Cashin's expression cooled immediately. "Why?" "According to the butler, London woke up scandalized this morning." Dr. Whitmore's mouth twitched faintly. "Apparently you abducted a noblewoman during a ballroom uprising." Serafina looked down quickly, mortified. Cashin remained unmoved. "And Whitmore? Concerned about association with the Vailcrest family now that gossip suggests financial instability and domestic unpleasantness." Dr. Whitmore closed his medical bag calmly. "The engagement negotiations may collapse." Serafina felt cold shock spread through her chest. Helena would consider that catastrophic. Aurelia's marriage represented salvation for the family finances. "My mother will blame me," Cashin answered before the physician could. "Your mother blames you for weather patterns." The dryness of the statement startled an almost disbelieving breath of laughter from Serafina before she could stop it. Silence followed immediately afterward because she could not remember the last time laughter escaped her naturally instead of politely. Cashin looked at her then. Fully. Something quiet shifted behind his gray eyes, watching the surprise on her face. Dr. Whitmore noticed it too. Very carefully, the physician glanced away. "I will send ice upstairs later," he announced with suspicious neutrality before departing the room entirely. The suite fell silent once more after the door closed behind him. Serafina stared toward the fire because suddenly she felt dangerously exposed in ways entirely unrelated to scandal. "I should apologize," she murmured softly. "For laughing?" Cashin asked. "No," she folded her hands together tightly again. "For causing complications within your household." Cashin crossed the room slowly, then stopping beside the breakfast tray near the fireplace. "Sit," he said quietly. Serafina blinked once. "Your Grace, you have not eaten since yesterday afternoon." His tone allowed absolutely no room for argument. Strange how commanding concern felt coming from him. Serafina moved slowly toward the chair beside the fire and sat almost automatically. Cashin poured tea himself from the silver pot resting on the tray before handing her the cup. The simple domestic gesture felt more intimate than physical touch somehow. "Thank you." "Eat." Again the quiet authority. Serafina picked up a piece of toast, mostly because disobeying him suddenly felt impossible. Cashin remained standing nearby, watching the snow beyond the windows while she forced herself to take several small bites. Finally, she lowered the toast carefully back onto the plate. "You still have not answered my question completely." Cashin glanced toward her. "Which question?" "Why me?" The room seemed to still slightly around the words. Firelight shifted softly across dark wood and cream walls. Somewhere downstairs a grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour. Cashin rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair opposite hers. 3 years ago, he said quietly, your father attended a parliamentary fundraiser at Ashford Hall. Serafina frowned faintly. I remember. Mother remained furious for weeks because he returned drunk. He also brought you. Her breath caught softly. You were there. Yes. Memory flickered suddenly through her mind. A massive estate glowing beneath summer lanterns. Politicians and noblemen gathered across marble terraces overlooking the gardens. She had spent most of the evening alone near the western greenhouse because Helena considered her socially unhelpful. There was a storm, she whispered. Cashin's gaze remained fixed on her face. Yes. The memory sharpened further. Rain arriving suddenly across the gardens. Servants rushing to protect expensive decorations. A terrified stable boy struggling to calm a panicked horse near the carriage path while guests ignored him completely. Serafina had crossed through the rain, instinctively helping steady the frightened animal despite ruining her dress in the mud. She remembered someone watching from the terrace above afterward, though she never saw the face clearly through the storm. That was you, she realized softly. Cashin said nothing. He did not need to. Understanding moved slowly through her now, piece by piece rearranging the last several years into something almost impossible to comprehend. You remembered me, she whispered. Yes. For 3 years. Longer than that. Serafina stared at him, completely speechless now, while snow drifted silently beyond the windows and firelight flickered across the room prepared for her long before she ever arrived. Serafina could not stop staring at him after that. Firelight moved softly across the sharp lines of Cashin Evermere's face while snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows behind him. 3 years. The number echoed strangely through her thoughts because she could barely comprehend it. 3 years of memory she had not known existed inside another person. 3 years during which someone had noticed her at all. That is impossible, she whispered finally. Cashin did not argue. No, he said quietly. Only inconvenient. Serafina lowered her gaze toward the untouched tea cooling slowly between her hands. Her thoughts moved back toward Ashford Hall again despite herself. Summer rain soaking through pale blue silk. Mud staining her slippers while terrified guests rushed indoors protecting jewels and reputations rather than the stable boy struggling with the frightened horse. She remembered calming the animal by speaking softly against its neck while rainwater ran through her hair and sleeves. Later Helena had called her behavior humiliating because ladies do not crawl through mud for servants. Serafina had forgotten the evening entirely afterward. Cashin clearly had not. Why would you remember something so insignificant? She asked softly. Because it was not insignificant. His answer arrived immediately. Calm. Certain. Most people reveal themselves clearly when inconvenience becomes possible. Serafina looked toward him again. I do not understand. Cashin crossed slowly toward the fireplace before resting one hand lightly against the marble mantel. The stable boy was dismissed from Ashford Hall 2 days later for negligence. Her chest tightened faintly. What happened to him? He works here now. Serafina blinked once in surprise. Cashin continued evenly. You were the only guest who crossed the terrace during the storm despite ruining your dress and embarrassing your mother publicly. A faint pause. You were shaking afterward. The memory returned sharply then. Standing alone near the servants' entrance soaked completely through while Helena hissed furious criticism beneath her breath about appearances and disgrace. Serafina remembered clenching her freezing fingers together hard enough to stop trembling visibly. She had thought no one noticed. Cashin had. You watched all that, she said quietly. Yes. Why? For the first time since entering the room that morning, Cashin hesitated slightly before answering. Because I recognized it. The sentence settled heavily into the silence between them. Serafina frowned faintly. Recognized what? His gray eyes held hers steadily. The difference between discipline and fear. Fire cracked softly inside the hearth. Somewhere downstairs distant footsteps crossed polished floors before fading again. Serafina suddenly became aware of how close he stood to her chair now. Not improperly close. Yet near enough that she could catch the faint scent of cedar and winter air again beneath the warmth of the fire. Your mother controlled rooms through humiliation, Cashin said quietly. My father preferred silence. Serafina remained completely still. Cashin Evermere rarely spoke about himself publicly. London knew fragments only. A powerful duke. Ruthless in parliament. Brilliant with finance. emotionally inaccessible. Beyond that, society mostly invented stories to fill the silence he left behind. The late Duke? She asked carefully. Cashin's expression did not change. Yes. Serafina remembered vague rumors from years ago. A cold household. Endless expectations. A mother who died young. Yet aristocratic gossip always blurred truth into entertainment. She had never imagined asking him directly. He valued obedience above all else, Cashin continued evenly. Weakness irritated him. Emotion embarrassed him. Serafina felt something painful tighten quietly beneath her ribs because the words sounded unbearably familiar. You were afraid of him. Cashin looked toward the fire briefly before answering. No, a pause. I was trained by him. Somehow that sounded worse. Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable. Heavy instead. Serafina realized suddenly that this might be the longest honest conversation she had ever experienced with another person. No manipulation hidden beneath politeness. No social performance. Just truth spoken plainly enough to leave marks. Did your mother know? She asked softly. Cashin's gaze shifted back toward her. About what? How he treated you. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his face then vanished. My mother noticed everything. Another pause. She died before she could change anything. Serafina lowered her eyes immediately because grief moved quietly beneath the sentence despite his calm tone. She understood hidden grief intimately. Not because she experienced much kindness herself. Because she spent years recognizing pain concealed beneath perfect posture and controlled voices. I am sorry, she whispered. Cashin studied her silently for several seconds. Most people say that automatically. I do not. The words escaped before caution could stop them. His attention sharpened faintly. No, he agreed softly. You do not. The room seemed strangely smaller suddenly beneath his gaze. Serafina looked away first toward the snow-covered gardens beyond the windows. Is that why you intervened last night? She asked quietly. Because you saw something familiar? Cashin remained silent long enough that she thought perhaps he would not answer. Then finally he spoke. Partly. Her pulse quickened faintly. What was the other reason? Another pause. More dangerous this time. You never learned how valuable you are. The word struck harder than cruelty ever had because her mind rejected them instantly. Valuable. Helena always measured value visibly. Beauty. Dowry. Social influence. Marriage prospects. Serafina possessed none of those sufficiently. You are mistaken. Cashin's voice remained calm. No. You barely know me. I know enough. His certainty frightened her because she realized suddenly he believed every word completely. Serafina stood abruptly from the chair beside the fire mostly because sitting beneath his attention had become unbearable. She crossed toward the windows instinctively needing distance from the strange dangerous warmth spreading slowly through her chest. Snow covered the eastern gardens entirely now. White roses beneath winter frost. Iron benches half buried beneath drifts. My entire life, she said softly while staring outside. I have been told exactly what I lack. Cashin said nothing behind her. That made continuing easier somehow. Not beautiful enough beside Aurelia. Not charming enough for society. Too quiet. Too serious. Too emotional when I speak and too cold when I remain silent. Her fingers tightened lightly against the curtain fabric. Eventually you stop arguing. Silence again. Then footsteps behind her. Slow. Controlled. Cashin stopped several feet away rather than approaching closer. And if they were wrong? Serafina laughed once quietly without humor. An entire lifetime of people? Yes. She turned toward him then. That is easy for you to say. You are Cashin Evermere. The words escaped sharper than intended. You enter rooms and people rearrange themselves automatically. You have power. Certainty. Position. Firelight moved softly across his face. None of those things prevent loneliness. Serafina fell silent immediately. Cashin looked toward the snowy gardens beyond her shoulder instead of directly at her now. Power only changes the type of isolation, he said quietly. People still see what benefits them most. The honesty inside the statement unsettled her because it carried exhaustion rather than arrogance. She thought suddenly of the ballroom again. women watching him carefully, men measuring themselves against him constantly, everyone performing around the Duke of Evermere instead of simply existing beside him. "And what do you see?" she asked before she could stop herself. Cashin's gaze returned to her slowly. "You truly wish to know?" Her heartbeat stumbled faintly. "Yes." He studied her for several long quiet seconds. Serafina became painfully aware of every detail at once. The warmth of the fire against her back, snow tapping softly against the windows, the white bandage around her hand, the terrifying steadiness of his attention. Finally Cashin answered, "I see a woman taught to survive by becoming invisible." His voice remained low, controlled. "And I think the people who failed to notice her were fools." The room went completely still after that. Serafina felt something inside her crack softly beneath the weight of the words. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice beginning to split beneath winter sunlight. She looked away immediately because suddenly breathing felt difficult. No one had ever spoken about her that way before. Not once. Helena criticized. Aurelia overshadowed. Her father avoided. Society overlooked. Yet Cashin Evermere looked at her as though absence itself had become unacceptable. "You should not say things like that," she whispered. "Why?" "Because people begin believing them." Cashin moved closer then. Only one step. Enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold morning light near the windows. "Perhaps," he said softly, "that is exactly the problem." Before Serafina could answer, a sharp knock sounded suddenly at the suite doors. Both of them turned instinctively. Clara entered moments later, visibly nervous. "Your Grace." She curtsied quickly. "Lady Helena Veilcrest has arrived." Silence fell instantly. Serafina felt all warmth drain from her body at once. Clara swallowed carefully before continuing. "She is demanding entrance to the East Wing immediately." Cashin's expression became unreadable again with frightening speed. "And?" Clara hesitated. "She brought a solicitor." Serafina's fingers tightened unconsciously against the curtain beside her, while fear rose cold and familiar through her chest. Helena had not come for reconciliation. She had come for war. For a brief terrible second, Serafina forgot how to breathe. Fear arrived instantly and completely. Familiar. Precise. Her body reacted before thought could follow. Shoulders tightening. Hands going cold. Every instinct she possessed urging silence and obedience before Helena Veilcrest entered the room. Cashin noticed the shift immediately. His expression did not change, yet something in the atmosphere around him sharpened with quiet danger. "Where is she now?" he asked Clara evenly. "In the West Drawing Room, Your Grace." Clara hesitated. "The solicitor is insisting Miss Veilcrest must return home immediately to avoid scandal." Cashin's gaze remained perfectly calm. "Interesting." Clara lowered her eyes quickly. "Mrs. Ashbourne asked whether you wished additional staff station near the East Corridor." "Yes." His answer came without pause. "And no one enters this wing without my permission." Serafina looked toward him sharply. The instruction sounded less like household management and more like fortification. Clara curtsied quickly before disappearing through the doors once more. Silence settled over the suite immediately afterward. Serafina stared toward the closed doorway, unable to stop imagining Helena downstairs inside Evermere House. Perfectly dressed. Perfectly controlled. Furious. "I should go to her," she whispered automatically. Cashin turned toward her slowly. "No. She will only become worse if ignored." "Yes." The calm agreement startled her. "Then why?" "Because fear is not obedience." The sentence landed hard enough that she fell silent immediately. Cashin crossed toward the fireplace once more before pouring fresh tea into her cooling cup with measured precision. Steam curled softly upward between them. "Your mother believes pressure creates compliance," he said quietly. "She will escalate until resistance disappears." Serafina looked down at her bandaged hand. "Usually it does." Cashin set the teapot aside carefully. "Not this time." The certainty inside his voice should not have affected her as strongly as it did. Yet warmth spread dangerously through her chest anyway. Dangerous because trust always carried consequences eventually. "You underestimate her," she murmured. No, his gray eyes lifted toward hers steadily. I understand her perfectly. A soft knock interrupted before she could answer. Mrs. Ashbourne entered carrying several folded newspapers against one arm. Her composed expression remained intact though faint disapproval sharpened her mouth. London has become unbearable already, she announced dryly. Cashin extended one hand silently. Mrs. Ashbourne passed him the top newspaper first. Seraphina caught sight of enormous printed headlines immediately. Duke of Evermere removes young lady from winter assembly. Another beneath it read, Valecrest family dispute turns public. Shame rose instantly through Seraphina's chest. Of course the city would enjoy this. Society fed itself through scandal and humiliation disguised as concern. Cashin skimmed the first page briefly before folding the newspaper closed again without visible reaction. Predictable, he said calmly. Mrs. Ashbourne glanced toward Seraphina more gently. Most accounts favor you, surprisingly. Seraphina blinked once. Favor me? Witnesses describe Lady Helena's behavior as excessive. A pause. Particularly after His Grace intervened publicly. Cashin remained unmoved by the information. Mrs. Ashbourne continued carefully. Unfortunately, several papers also speculate regarding improper relations. Seraphina felt heat rise immediately into her face. Cashin merely looked bored. London imagines impropriety whenever a man displays basic humanity toward a woman. Mrs. Ashbourne's mouth twitched faintly. True. Although removing unmarried daughters from ballrooms personally does encourage creativity. To Seraphina's complete shock, Cashin almost smiled. The expression lasted barely a second before disappearing entirely. Still, the effect unsettled her more than seriousness might have. Mrs. Ashbourne noticed too. Very carefully she looked away. Lady Helena demanded private audience upstairs, she informed Cashin. I refused. Good. She threatened legal action. Against whom? Cashin asked mildly. Me, Seraphina whispered before Mrs. Ashbourne could answer. She will claim I am unstable or manipulated. Cashin looked toward her immediately. Would that concern you? Yes. The honesty escaped before pride could stop it. Women disappear quietly that way. Silence followed. Heavy this time. Mrs. Ashbourne studied Seraphina thoughtfully while Cashin remained motionless beside the fireplace. Finally he spoke. No one will remove you from this house against your will. The statement carried absolute authority, not reassurance. Promise. Seraphina realized suddenly he had likely spoken similar words before in entirely different circumstances. To politicians perhaps. Enemies. Men who understood power when they heard it. The thought unsettled her strangely. You speak as though ownership matters, she whispered before thinking. Cashin's gaze sharpened faintly. Protection matters. The correction arrived instantly. Yet something beneath it remained dangerously close to possession anyway. Mrs. Ashbourne cleared her throat softly. There is another matter. Cashin looked toward her. Lord Whitmore officially withdrew his son's engagement proposal from Aurelia Valecrest 30 minutes ago. Seraphina stared at her in shock. Already? Apparently Lord Whitmore fears association with financial instability and public scandal simultaneously. Mrs. Ashbourne's tone remained coolly unimpressed. Cowardice disguised as prudence usually moves quickly in aristocratic circles. Helena would be furious beyond measure now. Aurelia's marriage represented survival for the family finances. Without it, desperation would worsen rapidly. Seraphina closed her eyes briefly. This is my fault. No, Cashin said immediately. It is the consequence of your mother building a household entirely upon fear and transactions. Aurelia did nothing wrong. Cashin regarded her quietly. You still protect people who abandoned you. Seraphina looked away because she did not know how to explain it. Aurelia had never been cruel exactly. Only comfortable inside a system that hurt someone else instead of herself. Habit, she whispered finally. Mrs. Ashbourne studied her for one long thoughtful second before turning toward Cashin again. Lady Helena grows increasingly aggressive downstairs. Good. The single word chilled the room slightly. Seraphina frowned faintly. Good. Cashin folded the newspapers carefully onto the nearby table. People reveal themselves most clearly when control begins slipping. Unease moved quietly beneath her ribs because suddenly he sounded less like a duke managing scandal, and more like a strategist observing a battlefield already mapped carefully in advance. You expected this, she realized softly. Cassian did not answer immediately, which itself felt like answer enough. Your Grace, she said carefully, what exactly are you planning? He looked toward her then with unnerving steadiness. That depends. On what? On whether your mother intends negotiation. A pause. Or war. The room fell silent again except for the soft crackle of firewood burning low in the hearth. Serafina became suddenly aware of how trapped Helena must feel downstairs. Financial collapse approaching. Aurelia's engagement destroyed. Public humiliation spreading through London newspapers by the hour. And now Serafina herself beyond reach inside Evermere House, protected by the most powerful man in Parliament. Fear shifted uneasily through her chest because desperate people became dangerous. Helena especially. She will not surrender control quietly, Serafina whispered. Cassian's expression remained unreadable. No, then after a brief pause he added softly, neither will I. The words settled through the room with terrifying calm. Serafina looked at him fully then. Really looked. Cassian Evermere stood beside the fire dressed in dark charcoal and winter light with complete stillness wrapped around him like armor. No visible anger. No uncertainty. Only controlled inevitability. And suddenly Serafina understood something that frightened her more than Helena arriving with lawyers and threats downstairs. Cassian had not rescued her impulsively from a ballroom. He had chosen a side long before the first dance even began. Another knock sounded sharply through the suite doors before anyone could speak again. This time the interruption carried tension immediately. Clara entered pale-faced and breathless. Your Grace. She swallowed carefully. Lady Helena forced her way past the west corridor staff. Serafina's entire body went rigid. Clara looked toward the hallway behind her nervously. She is coming upstairs now. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed sharply through the corridor beyond the suite before Helena Veilcrest appeared in the doorway without invitation. She wore deep burgundy silk trimmed with black lace despite the early hour, every dark curl pinned perfectly into place as though rage itself had been disciplined into elegance. Behind her stood a narrow gray-haired solicitor clutching a leather case against his chest, while two visibly nervous footmen lingered several feet back uncertain whether they were witnessing a social dispute or a declaration of war. Helena's gaze found Serafina instantly. Not relief. Not concern. Assessment. There you are. The words landed cold and precise across the room. Serafina felt her body tense automatically, though she remained standing near the windows instead of moving forward. Cassian noticed both things. Helena stepped farther inside without waiting for permission. You have embarrassed this family enough, she continued sharply. Collect your things. We are leaving. Cassian did not move from beside the fireplace. No, the single word stopped everyone briefly. Helena turned toward him slowly. Your Grace, whatever fascination this absurd situation has created for you, it ends now. Cassian's expression remained perfectly calm. Interesting. Helena's jaw tightened. I beg your pardon? You continue speaking as though Miss Veilcrest belongs to you. The solicitor shifted awkwardly near the doorway, sensing immediately that he had entered dangerous territory far above legal documents and inheritance law. Helena ignored him completely. She is my daughter. Cassian looked toward Serafina instead. Is that how she has been treated? Silence crashed heavily through the room afterward. Helena's eyes flashed sharply. You presume authority in matters you do not understand. No, Cassian replied evenly. I simply recognize cruelty more quickly than you expected. Serafina lowered her gaze instinctively, because fear still moved automatically through her body whenever Helena's anger sharpened. Yet another feeling existed beneath it now too. Awareness. She could feel Cassian standing between them without physically blocking anything at all. Helena noticed the shift immediately. Serafina. Her mother's voice softened suddenly with practiced control. Come here. Reflex urged obedience instantly. Years of conditioning tightened through Serafina's chest almost painfully. Yet her feet remained still against the carpet. Helena saw that. The silence afterward became unbearable. You misunderstand what is happening, Helena continued carefully. His Grace enjoys power. Men like him interfere because they can. Cashin remained motionless. Helena stepped closer toward Serafina instead. You think this is rescue? It is not. Society already speaks about you as though you are his mistress. Shame burned hot across Serafina's skin. Helena pressed immediately into the weakness. No respectable man keeps an unmarried woman hidden inside his home unless he intends scandal. Enough. Cashin's voice remained quiet. That made Helena turn sharply toward him anyway. You will not silence me regarding my own child. I will silence dishonesty. The room seemed to cool several degrees beneath the sentence. Helena laughed once without humor. Dishonesty. Cashin finally moved away from the fireplace then. Slow. Controlled. Terrifying in his calmness. He crossed toward the windows where Serafina stood frozen beside the curtain. You informed society for years that your younger daughter lacked value. His gray eyes never left Helena's face. Then attempted selling her into financial rescue when your husband's investments collapsed. The solicitor looked visibly alarmed now. Helena's expression hardened instantly. Careful. No. Cashin stopped beside Serafina without touching her. You are no longer in a position to issue warnings inside my house. Helena stared at him with undisguised fury. You speak as though you know everything. Enough. The word landed heavier this time. I know about Lord Harrow. I know about the debts hidden through your sister's accounts in Sussex. And I know you intended finalizing negotiations for Serafina's marriage within the month regardless of her consent. Serafina felt cold shock move through her chest. Helena had hidden the severity even from her. Helena recovered quickly though. She always did. Every aristocratic marriage involves negotiation, not ownership. Women require security, not imprisonment. Silence followed sharply. Helena's breathing remained perfectly measured despite the fury visible beneath her composure now. You have become emotionally compromised, she said coldly. That is dangerous for a man in your position. Cashin's expression did not shift at all. And you have mistaken emotional neglect for parenting. Helena turned abruptly toward Serafina then. Look at him, she said sharply. A powerful man playing savior because he discovered a pathetic girl desperate enough to worship basic attention. The word struck harder than Serafina expected because some frightened part of her had already whispered similar fears privately throughout the night. Cashin spoke before silence could deepen the wound. No. Helena ignored him completely. Do you truly imagine this ends well for you? She demanded toward Serafina. Men like him do not marry women like you. They become bored eventually and move on while society destroys what remains afterward. Serafina felt her throat tighten painfully. Helena stepped closer sensing weakness again. Come home now and this can still disappear quietly. Cashin's gaze shifted toward Serafina then. Not controlling. Not demanding. Waiting. Helena noticed immediately and grew sharper. You see, she snapped. Even now he refuses promises because he knows exactly what this is. Serafina looked between them slowly. Helena standing rigid in dark silk and fury. Cashin silent beside the windows with winter light resting across his face. Fear twisted inside her because Helena's words touched every insecurity she possessed. Cashin had protected her, observed her, remembered her for years. But why? People did not invest themselves into broken women without eventually expecting payment. Helena saw uncertainty flicker across her daughter's face and pressed harder instantly. You are embarrassing yourself for a fantasy, she whispered harshly. He does not love you. The room went still. Completely. Serafina wished suddenly the floor would disappear beneath her because humiliation burned through her chest all over again. She had never asked for love. Never imagined it remotely possible. Yet hearing Helena say the word aloud made the absence of it ache anyway. Cashin's voice cut cleanly through the silence before shame could settle completely. No. Helena turned sharply toward him. Cashin looked directly at Serafina while speaking. I respect her. The sentence landed softly. Yet somehow it shattered the room harder than rage could have. Serafina stared at him unable to breathe properly for several seconds, because respect had never sounded so intimate before. Helena laughed bitterly. Respect? Yes. Cashin remained perfectly calm. I respect the fact she remained kind despite everything done to her. His gaze never left Serafina's face now. I respect that she protects people who fail her repeatedly. I respect that she still apologizes before taking up space because no one taught her she was allowed to exist without permission. Every word struck somewhere painfully deep inside her chest. Helena's expression darkened further with every sentence because the room itself had shifted away from her control completely. "You sentimental fool," Helena whispered coldly. "You think kindness survives power?" Cashin finally looked toward Helena again. Noah paused. "I think people like you spend their lives trying to destroy it, because you no longer possess any yourselves." The solicitor quietly stepped backward toward the hallway at that point, likely reconsidering every career decision leading him here. Helena stood completely still beneath the weight of the insult. Then slowly, dangerously, she turned toward Serafina one final time. "If you remain here," she said quietly, "you are no longer my daughter." The words should have destroyed her. For years they would have. Serafina waited automatically for the panic. The desperate need to apologize. To surrender. To become smaller quickly enough that Helena might still allow her back into conditional safety. Instead, something else happened. She looked at her mother carefully for the first time without fear entirely controlling the moment. Helena stood flawless and furious and deeply terrified beneath all the perfection. Not terrified of losing a daughter. Terrified of losing control. The realization hurt quietly. Completely. Serafina felt tears threaten suddenly behind her eyes, though her voice remained steady when she finally answered. "I do not think," she whispered softly, "you were ever truly my mother at all." Silence crashed through the suite afterward. Helena stared at her daughter as though struck speechless for the first time in years. Cashin did not interrupt. Did not move. He simply remained beside Serafina with terrifying stillness while she stood on shaking legs, saying aloud the truth she had survived around her entire life. Helena's face lost color slowly beneath the winter light. "You ungrateful child." Serafina almost flinched automatically. Almost. Then Cashin stepped half a pace closer beside her. Not touching. Simply present. The movement steadied something inside her instantly. Helena noticed that too. Fury sharpened her posture further. "Very well," she said coldly. "When society ruins you afterward, do not expect rescue from me." Cashin answered before Serafina could. "She never received rescue from you." Helena's eyes flashed toward him one final time, filled with hatred now stripped entirely of elegance. Then without another word she turned sharply and swept from the suite with black lace and humiliation trailing behind her like smoke. The solicitor hurried after her immediately. The doors closed hard enough to rattle the windows faintly. Silence remained afterward. Heavy. Unsteady. Serafina stared toward the closed doorway, unable to move, because suddenly every emotion she had suppressed for years threatened collapse at once. Cashin looked at her quietly. "Serafina." The sound of her name in his voice undid the last fragile piece of composure she possessed. She turned away, immediately pressing trembling fingers against her mouth as tears finally slipped free despite every attempt to stop them. Not loud crying. Worse. Silent tears born from exhaustion and grief, and the unbearable shock of finally being defended after spending a lifetime believing she deserved none of it at all. Cashin crossed toward her slowly, careful, as though approaching something wounded enough that sudden movement might shatter it completely. "Look at me," he said softly. She could not. He waited. No pressure. Just impossible patience. Finally Serafina lifted tear-filled gray eyes toward him. Cashin reached up then and with astonishing gentleness brushed one tear away from beneath her cheekbone using the edge of his thumb. "You were never difficult to love," he said quietly. "Only surrounded by people too selfish to do it properly." Serafina did not remember crossing the distance between them. One moment she stood trembling beside the windows with tears slipping silently down her face. The next she realized Cashin Evermere's hand still rested gently against her cheek, while the entire world seemed to have narrowed into warmth and winter light and impossible quiet. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Not once in 23 years. Difficult to love. The phrase echoed painfully through her chest because she had spent most of her life believing the opposite so completely that hearing another truth felt almost unbearable. Cashin lowered his hand slowly as though giving her space to retreat if she wished. She did not move away. The realization startled both of them briefly. Outside the tall windows, Snow continued drifting softly across the eastern gardens of Evermere House. Inside, the fire burned low and golden against marble while silence settled gently around them instead of threatening collapse. Serafina pressed trembling fingers briefly beneath her eyes before looking away. "You should not say things you do not mean." Cashin's voice remained calm. "I never do." She believed him instantly. That frightened her most of all. For several moments neither spoke again. Then softly, almost uncertainly, Serafina asked, "What happens now?" Cashin looked toward the closed suite doors where Helena had disappeared only minutes earlier. "Your mother will attempt social retaliation first." His tone turned practical once more, though warmth still lingered quietly beneath it. "She will spread rumors regarding impropriety, question your stability, possibly attempt financial coercion through your father." Serafina managed a faint, exhausted laugh. "You say all that very calmly. Because none of it concerns me." She looked up sharply. Cashin held her gaze steadily. "And it should not concern you either." The confidence inside him felt immovable. Not arrogance. Certainty earned through years of surviving power struggles larger than ballroom scandals and bitter mothers. Serafina lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the fireplace because exhaustion had finally settled fully into her bones. Cashin remained standing nearby, watching her carefully. "You are tired." "I think I have been tired for a very long time." The honesty escaped before she could soften it. Cashin's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said quietly. "You have." She looked toward the fire again. "I do not know how to exist like this." "Like what?" "Without waiting for punishment." Silence followed softly. Then Cashin crossed toward the chair opposite hers and sat down for the first time since entering the room that morning. The movement felt strangely significant. Less like a duke issuing commands. More like a man choosing to remain. "You learn slowly," he said. "Most wounds caused by fear do not disappear quickly." Serafina studied him carefully across the firelight. "And you know this from experience." Cashin did not answer immediately. Finally he said, "My father believed affection weakened discipline." Serafina felt quiet sadness move through her chest again. "Did anyone love you properly?" The question escaped before caution could stop it. Cashin looked toward the flames rather than her. "My mother tried." The softness inside those three words hurt more than elaborate tragedy might have. Serafina thought suddenly of the portrait on the staircase. The lonely woman in green silk standing beside the frozen lake. Mrs. Ashbourne said she was lonely. A faint pause. She was isolated. Cashin's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "My father valued appearances above intimacy." She survived by becoming quieter every year until eventually silence consumed her completely. Serafina understood immediately. Too immediately. "That is a terrible way to live." Cashin looked toward her then. "Yes." Something passed quietly between them after that. Recognition, perhaps. Two people shaped differently by households where love became conditional and silence became survival. Serafina realized suddenly she no longer felt frightened of him. Overwhelmed, perhaps. Unsteady, certainly. But not afraid. The distinction mattered more than she could explain. Another knock interrupted gently before the silence deepened further. Mrs. Ashbourne entered carrying a single cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "This arrived from Lady Aurelia," she informed Serafina softly. Surprise flickered across Serafina's face. Aurelia had written to her directly only a handful of times in their entire lives despite living in the same house. Mrs. Ashbourne handed over the letter before quietly retreating once more. Serafina stared at the seal for several seconds before breaking it carefully. Aurelia's elegant handwriting filled the page. "Serafina, I do not know if you will believe me after everything, but I am sorry. Not only for last night. For years of seeing what Mother did and convincing myself silence meant innocence. I thought survival required obedience. Perhaps I was wrong. Lord Whitmore ended the engagement this morning. Mother has locked herself inside the blue drawing room since returning home. Father says nothing. The house feels colder without you somehow. I hope you are safe. Truly safe. Aurelia." Serafina lowered the letter slowly afterward. Her throat tightened painfully again, though this time the emotion felt different. Not grief exactly. Mourning, perhaps. For all the years lost between sisters living beside each other without honesty. Bad news? Cashin asked quietly. No, she looked down at the letter once more. Only sad news. He waited without pressing further. Serafina folded the paper carefully against her lap. Aurelia apologized. Cashin's eyebrows lifted faintly. That is unexpected. Yes. She stared into the fire thoughtfully. I think we were both raised to survive differently. Silence settled softly once more. Then from somewhere downstairs distant piano music drifted faintly upward through Evermere House. Slow. Melancholy. Beautiful. Serafina listened quietly before realizing the melody. Claire de Lune. Who is playing? She asked softly. Cashin's expression shifted almost imperceptibly again. I am. She blinked once in surprise. You play piano? Poorly according to my tutors. And according to you? Something very close to amusement touched his voice then. Adequately. Serafina found herself smiling faintly before she could stop it. Cashin noticed immediately. Not the polite social smile she wore at gatherings. Something smaller. Real. His gaze rested on her face quietly enough that warmth spread through her chest all over again. Dangerous warmth. The kind capable of changing lives permanently if trusted too deeply. There is something else you should know, he said after a moment. Her pulse quickened faintly. What? Cashin leaned back slightly in the chair opposite hers. Firelight moved across the sharp lines of his face, while snow continued falling beyond the windows behind him. 3 months ago, he said calmly, before Blackmere House invited your family, I approached your father privately. Serafina stared at him. Why? To discuss a marriage arrangement. The room seemed to still completely. Aurelia, she whispered automatically. Cashin held her gaze steadily. No, her breath caught sharply. Silence expanded between them heavy enough to alter the air itself. Serafina could hear the crackle of firewood, the distant piano downstairs. Her own heartbeat stumbling unevenly beneath her ribs. You cannot mean, Cashin interrupted softly. I asked for you. She could not think. For several terrifying seconds her mind refused comprehension entirely because the idea felt impossible. Men did not choose Serafina Veilcrest. They tolerated her politely beside Aurelia's beauty, ignored her beside Helena's force, used her as financial solution during desperate negotiations. They did not choose her first. Ever. My father refused, she whispered faintly. Cashin nodded once. Helena refused. Understanding crashed slowly into place piece by piece. The prepared room. The dresses. The roses. The invitation. The way Cashin looked at her as though absence itself offended him. None of it had begun last night. Why? She asked again, though the word barely emerged properly. Cashin stood slowly from the chair across the fire and crossed toward her with measured calm. He stopped directly before her this time, close enough that winter cedar surrounded her senses once more. Because, he said quietly, I spent 3 years watching a remarkable woman believe she was invisible. His gray eyes held hers completely now. And I decided I would not allow it any longer. Serafina felt tears rise again instantly. Not from pain this time. Something far more frightening. Hope. Cashin reached toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead she placed her trembling hand into his before fear could stop her. Warmth closed gently around her fingers. Steady. Certain. Real. Outside Evermere House snow continued falling softly across London, while somewhere far away society still whispered scandals and ruined reputations and dangerous rumors about a silent duke and the forgotten girl he claimed publicly before an entire ballroom. But inside the East Suite beneath firelight and winter roses, Serafina Veilcrest finally understood something that changed her life forever. She had never been hard to love. She had simply never before belonged anywhere love was allowed to reach her.